The wind sweeping across the valley of Shaoshan in Hunan province carried the scent of wet soil, burning wood, and the quiet despair of rural China at the turn of the 20th century. It was a landscape locked in ancient rhythms, yet trembling under the heavy footsteps of history. Born on December 26, 1893, Mao Zedong entered a world that was slowly coming apart at the seams. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for more than 250 years, was rotting from within, hollowed out by decades of imperialist exploitation, military defeats, corruption, and crushing taxation. For the peasants who tilled the earth, life was a relentless cycle of backbreaking labor, hunger, and vulnerability to the whims of nature and local tyrants. Yet, young Mao was not born into the desperate destitution of the landless peasantry. His father, Mao Zedong, was a remarkable product of this changing society. Starting his life as a poor peasant burdened by heavy debts, Zedong had enlisted in the army, saved his money with fierce discipline, and returned to Shaoshan to buy back his family's land and expand it. Through shrewd business ventures, trading grain, lending money, and transporting goods, he elevated himself to the status of a rich peasant or petty landlord. Growing up in this household meant that Mao experienced a unique social duality. He was close to the soil, working alongside farm laborers in the fields from a young age, sharing their sweat and understanding the physical toll of rural toil. At the same time, he lived under the roof of a strict, ambitious, and financially astute father who expected his sons to master literacy and basic accounting to help manage the family estate. Mao's relationship with his father was tense, volatile, and deeply formative. Mao Zedong was a stern patriarch of the traditional Confucian mold, a man who believed in corporal punishment, hard work, and absolute filial obedience. He viewed his eldest surviving son as headstrong, lazy, and insufficiently respectful. Mao later recalled that his father frequently beat both him and his younger brothers, venting his frustrations when business deals went sour or when his sons resisted his authority. In stark contrast stood Mao's mother, Wen Kaimai. She was a gentle, deeply pious Buddhist who practiced quiet charity and offered a sanctuary of emotional warmth and empathy within the household. While the father represented the harsh, demanding structure of traditional Chinese authority, the mother represented mercy, compassion, and the quiet endurance of the common people. To escape his father's wrath, Mao learned to forge tactical alliances within the family, sometimes using classical Confucian texts as a shield against physical punishment. When his father accused him of lacking filial piety, Mao would cleverly quote ancient sages back at him, arguing that parents too had a duty to be kind and just to their children. Education began early for Mao, as it did for any boy whose family could afford it. At the local primary school in Shaoshan, which he began attending at age 8, he was immersed in the traditional Confucian classics. He memorized the ancient texts, learning the characters, the moral maxims, and the historical anecdotes that had shaped Chinese civilization for millennia. However, Mao quickly grew restless with the rigid, rote-learning methods of his conservative teachers. His rebellious personality chafed against the narrow boundaries of orthodox scholarship. Instead of focusing solely on the assigned lessons, Mao developed a voracious appetite for popular vernacular novels. Books like Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin, and Journey to the West captured his imagination. These stories were not the dry moral treatises favored by scholars. They were sprawling, epic tales of rebellion, banditry, military strategy, clever underdogs overthrowing corrupt officials, and righteous warriors fighting against tyranny. Characters who stood up to unjust authority and carved out their own destinies in the mountains resonated deeply with the young Mao, planting the early seeds of a romanticized revolutionary ethos. As Mao grew into his teens, the tensions with his father reached a boiling point. The friction peaked when Mao resisted an arranged marriage, a common practice in rural China where parents chose brides for their sons to secure labor and alliances. Mao flatly refused the match arranged by his father, a bold act of defiance against paternal authority. Around the same time, after a particularly fierce public argument in which his father insulted him in front of guests, Mao packed his belongings and fled the household, taking refuge at the home of a relative. Though he eventually returned and grudgingly fulfilled some family duties, the confrontation marked a permanent shift in power within the family. His father realized that this rebellious son could not be broken by force. Shortly thereafter, with the financial support of relatives and a recognition of his son's intellectual potential, Yicheng agreed to let Mao leave Shaoshan to pursue a broader education. Leaving his native village was a monumental turning point. In 1910, at the age of 16, Mao walked away from the sheltered valley of Shaoshan and traveled to the nearby town of Dongshan to attend a higher primary school. It was his first real step out of the local cocoon and into a wider world that was rapidly transforming. Dongshan Higher Primary School was modern in its outlook, introducing students to Western geography, mathematics, natural sciences, and modern history. For a boy who had spent his life surrounded by traditional Confucian scholarship, encountering subjects like global geography was an intellectual awakening. He learned that China was not, as traditional myth suggested, the center of the universe, but rather a vast, struggling nation surrounded by aggressive foreign powers that coveted its wealth and territory. The timing of Mao's emergence into the wider world coincided with the death throes of the imperial system. For decades, the Qing dynasty had tried and failed to modernize in the face of internal rebellions, such as the massive Taiping Rebellion and the anti-foreign Boxer Uprising, and humiliating defeats at the hands of Western nations and a rapidly modernizing Japan. Reformers had attempted to save the monarchy through constitutional changes, but it was too little, too late. In the autumn of 1911, the explosive revolutionary wave finally broke, sparked by an accidental bomb explosion in the city of Wuchang by revolutionary soldiers. An uprising swept across the provinces. Within weeks, the centuries-old imperial structure collapsed like a house of cards. The child Emperor Puyi abdicated, and the Republic of China was proclaimed under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen. For Mao, who was living in Changsha, the capital of Hunan province, at the time, the revolution was an electrifying spectacle. The city was a hotbed of political ferment. Mao eagerly joined the revolutionary student movement, cut off his queue, the long braid enforced by the Manchu conquerors as a sign of submission, as a public declaration of rebellion against the old order, and even briefly enlisted as a private soldier in the Provincial Revolutionary Army. However, the grand promise of the 1911 revolution quickly soured. Sun Yat-sen, lacking military power and unified political backing, was forced to step aside, and power fell into the hands of Yuan Shikai, a powerful former imperial general who soon sought to establish his own autocratic regime, and eventually declared himself emperor. China plunged into a chaotic era of warlordism, where provincial generals carved the country into personal fiefdoms, fighting endless wars that brought unprecedented suffering to the civilian population. This early experience of political betrayal and state collapse left an indelible mark on Mao's worldview. He learned that political power did not spring from parliamentary debates, idealistic constitutions, or moral appeals, but rather from military strength and organized force. The failure of the 1911 revolution taught him that sweeping away an old regime was only the first step. Without deep, structural transformation and armed protection, any new government would simply be hijacked by opportunistic tyrants and militarists. Returning to his studies after his brief stint in the army, Mao entered the Hunan First Normal School in Changsha in 1913. This institution would serve as his true intellectual crucible. For 5.5 years, Mao immersed himself in reading, writing, and intense philosophical debates. He studied history, ethics, logic, and classical literature under progressive and demanding teachers who encouraged critical thinking and social engagement. During these formative years at Changsha, Mao developed a fascination with Western philosophy and political thought. He devoured translations of works by prominent Western thinkers, including Adam Smith, Charles Darwin, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Huxley, and John Stuart Mill. He was particularly drawn to Friedrich Paulson's ethical idealism and the concept of individual will and moral strength. In the margins of his textbooks, Mao penned extensive commentary, arguing that a strong individual will could reshape society, overcome material constraints, and elevate the human spirit. Yet, Mao's worldview was never merely academic. He was deeply concerned with the practical, moral, and physical condition of the Chinese people. He believed that centuries of Confucian indoctrination had made Chinese society weak, passive, and submissive. To cure China's ills, he argued that the nation needed a total rejuvenation of mind, body, and spirit. In 1917, he published his very first major article, titled A Study of Physical Education, in the radical journal New Youth. In the essay, he boldly declared that China's traditional scholars were sickly weaklings who could not protect themselves, let alone the country. He argued that physical strength must go hand in hand with moral and intellectual development, writing that physical education complements education in virtue and intelligence. To preserve one's health and study diligently, one must first build physical strength. To put his theories into practice, Mao organized student groups, led strenuous hiking expeditions through the mountains of Hunan, swam in freezing rivers during winter, and slept outdoors to harden his body and build camaraderie with his peers. He founded the Zinman Study Association, New People's Study Society, in 1918, gathering a tight-knit circle of idealistic young intellectuals who debated politics, shared radical literature, and vowed to dedicate their lives to reforming China. As Mao prepared to graduate from the First Normal School in the summer of 1918, he stood at a vital crossroads. He was no longer the isolated, frustrated farm boy from the hills of Shaoshan. He had transformed into a sharp, ambitious, and politically awakened young intellectual, deeply attuned to the sufferings of his countrymen and burning with a desire to change the world. The chaotic, collapsing China of the warlord era had forged in him a fierce resilience and an uncompromising belief in radical action. The sheltered valley of his childhood was far behind him. The vast, turbulent stage of modern Chinese history was now waiting for his entrance. The crisp autumn air of Beijing carried a sharp bite in 1918, a stark contrast to the humid green valleys of Hunan that Mao Zedong had left behind. Armed with little more than a fierce ambition, a restless mind, and introductions from his beloved mentor Yang Changji, Mao stepped into the vast, sprawling capital of a fractured nation. Beijing was the political and cultural beating heart of China, yet it was a heart choked by corruption, foreign exploitation, and the constant threat of warlord dominance. For the young Mao, arriving in the capital marked his transition from a provincial student leader into a national revolutionary on the cusp of history. His initial days in Beijing were marked by humbling poverty and the quiet desperation of an outsider trying to find a foothold. Through Yang Changji, who had accepted a prestigious professorship at Peking University, Mao secured a humble position as an assistant in the university library. The job was arranged by the university's influential librarian, Lai Dajiao, who would soon become one of the foundational figures of Chinese Marxism. For Mao, sweeping floors, dusting thousands of volumes, and keeping records of faculty and student borrowers was grueling and low-paying work. Yet, the library was an Aladdin's cave of intellectual treasures, surrounded by towering stacks of books, journals, and newly translated Western treatises. Mao consumed everything he could lay his hands on. He was no longer restricted to the traditional Confucian texts of his youth, or the standard philosophical guides of his normal school days. He was breathing in the radical currents sweeping across the globe in the wake of the First World War and the Russian Revolution. Despite his menial tasks, Mao observed the vibrant intellectual elite of Peking University, with a mixture of awe and critical detachment. Professors and students alike gathered in bustling campus courtyards and lecture halls to debate the future of the nation, giving birth to what would become known as the New Culture movement. The central cry of this movement was a total rejection of traditional Confucian culture, which reformers blamed for keeping China weak, superstitious, and subservient. Icons like Chen Duxiu, the fiery dean of letters at the university and co-founder of the radical journal New Youth, argued that China needed to embrace Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy from the West if it ever hoped to shake off its feudal chains. Mao attended lectures, listened in on debates, and rubbed shoulders with the intellectual giants of the era, though his provincial Hunanese accent often made it difficult for him to converse comfortably with the elite scholars from the coastal provinces. Life in Beijing was also a struggle for basic survival. Mao lived in a cramped, drafty alleyway room shared with several other students from Hunan, sleeping packed tightly together on heated brick kang beds to ward off the freezing northern winter. He survived on meager meals, often stretching his tiny library salary to buy cheap buns and water. During this time, he met Yang Kaihui, the brilliant and intellectually curious daughter of Professor Yang Changji. A quiet, deep bond formed between Mao and Kaihui, forged through shared late-night political discussions, a mutual love for literature, and a growing devotion to the cause of national liberation. Kaihui offered Mao a deep emotional anchor in the cold, alien expanse of Beijing, and their relationship blossomed quietly amidst the political storm. The political storm broke into the open on May 4, 1919, igniting a national explosion that would irrevocably alter Mao's worldview and political trajectory. The catalyst came from the betrayal at the Paris Peace Conference ending the First World War. Despite China having contributed hundreds of thousands of laborers to the Allied war effort with the promise that German colonial concessions in China's Shandong province would be returned to Chinese sovereignty, the Western powers instead handed those territories directly to Japan. When news of this humiliating diplomatic defeat reached Beijing, student fury boiled over. On the afternoon of May 4, thousands of angry students from Peking University and other institutions poured out onto the streets, marching toward Tiananmen Square. They carried banners denouncing Japanese imperialism and domestic traitors, shouting slogans that demanded national salvation. The protests quickly turned violent when demonstrators attacked the residence of a pro-Japanese government official, setting fire to the building. The frantic warlord government responded with mass arrests, beating students and locking up hundreds in makeshift prisons. Although Mao was not at the very front of the initial march in Tiananmen Square, Having spent much of that spring traveling between Beijing, Shanghai, and Changsha organizing student groups, and visiting his ailing mother, the May 4th movement galvanized his entire generation. Returning to Changsha shortly after the uprising, Mao threw himself headfirst into local revolutionary organizing. He realized that Beijing was only the epicenter. The real fire had to be spread to the provinces, factories, and fields. He founded the United Students Association of Hunan and launched a radical weekly publication titled Xiang River Review. Through his fiery essays, Mao called for total social revolution, writing that the Chinese people had suffered enough under the triple bondage of warlords, patriarchal authority, and foreign imperialists. His prose was bold, urgent, and unyielding, warning that a great storm was coming, and that the people could no longer rely on half-measures or polite petitions. The Xiang River Review became a massive regional success, circulating widely among students, workers, and teachers across central China. Alarmed by the radical fervor and anti-government critiques pouring from Mao's pen, the reactionary Hunan warlord Zhang Jingyao quickly banned the journal and shut down the student association. But the suppression only hardened Mao's resolve. Rather than retreating, he traveled back to Beijing in late 1919 to lead delegations protesting the warlord's tyrannical rule in Hunan, orchestrating strikes, petitions, and public awareness campaigns that successfully forced the warlord to soften some of his harshest domestic policies. During this second stay in Beijing, Mao's intellectual evolution reached a critical turning point. He spent countless hours in deep discussions with Lai Dajiao, who had become one of the earliest and most passionate converts to Marxism-Leninism in China, following the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Lai argued that the old Western liberal model of parliamentary democracy had failed China, and that salvation lay in the militant, organized overthrow of the capitalist and imperialist order by the working class. Mao read translations of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, along with works by Lenin and anarchist thinkers like Peter Kropotkin. Years later, Mao would recall that during this winter in Beijing, he read 3 books with an intensity that shaped his core ideology: the Communist Manifesto, Kirkup's History of Socialism, and Weddell's History of Diplomacy. By the spring of 1920, Mao's mind had crystallized around Marxist principles. He wrote to friends that while he was still exploring various socialist theories, he found himself increasingly drawn to the Marxist view of historical materialism and class struggle. The idea that history was driven not by abstract moral principles or the great deeds of emperors, but by material conflicts between economic classes, resonated deeply with his practical, ruthless understanding of power. In the summer of 1920, Mao returned south to Hunan, determined to build a revolutionary base from the ground up. He took a job as a primary school principal in Changsha, which provided him with a salary, a secure address, and a shield of respectability behind which he could quietly organize underground Marxist study groups and labor unions. He married Yang Kaihui in a simple, non-traditional ceremony that rejected the formal rituals of ancestor worship and commercial bride buying, cementing a partnership of equals dedicated entirely to the revolutionary cause. By the summer of 1921, the whispers of underground study circles across China coalesced into an urgent national summons. Representatives from scattered Marxist groups were called to gather secretly in Shanghai to establish a unified vanguard party. Mao, representing the revolutionary cell in Hunan, packed his bags and traveled to the bustling coastal metropolis. There, dodging the surveillance of French police in the foreign concessions and warlord secret agents, a small group of around a dozen delegates met in a quiet brick house in the French concession to found the Chinese Communist Party. Mao was present at the First National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in July 1921, serving as a relatively junior secretary and logistics coordinator. The delegates debated ideological purity, the role of workers versus peasants, and whether to cooperate with Sun Yat-sen's Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. The atmosphere was charged with idealism, intellectual vanity, and utopian dreams of a proletarian uprising modeled directly on the Russian experience. Most of the delegates were urban intellectuals who viewed the factory workers of cities like Shanghai, Wuhan, and Guangzhou as the true revolutionary vanguard, paying little attention to the hundreds of millions of peasants tilling the soil in the countryside. Mao listened, took notes, and absorbed the theoretical debates, but his own instincts remained anchored in the mud and sweat of rural Hunan. He understood the Marxist texts, but his soul belonged to the desperate, overworked masses of the villages he had grown up around. The founding of the party was a monumental historical milestone, but it was just a fragile seed planted in hostile soil. As the Congress concluded amidst police raids and forced escapes, Mao returned to Hunan as a hardened, professional revolutionary, carrying the banner of Marxism into a society on the brink of total collapse. The industrial smoke of Shanghai and the quiet campus courtyards of Beijing felt a world away when Mao Zedong stepped off the boat onto the muddy banks of the Xiang River in late 1921. Armed with the newly minted ideas of Marxism-Leninism and his official title as the secretary of the Hunan branch of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao knew that building a revolution in China required more than printing pamphlets or debating theory in university libraries. The early leadership of the party, safe in the urban pockets of the coastal treaty ports, dreamed of a classic European-style proletarian revolution led by factory workers. But Mao saw the reality of China, a vast, suffering ocean of impoverished peasants who made up over 80% of the population. If the Communist Party was to survive and conquer, it had to find its strength in the countryside. His first major assignment took him directly to the dense, soot-stained industrial heart of Changsha, the Enyuan coal mines, and the nearby railway workshops. Enyuan was a hellish labyrinth of dark tunnels, suffocating heat, and brutal exploitation. Thousands of miners worked 12-hour shifts deep underground with little safety equipment, constantly threatened by cave-ins, explosions, and black lung disease. Their wages were meager, often paid in worthless local scrip, and they lived under the iron fist of corrupt foremen and armed guards hired by the mine owners. When Mao arrived in Enyuan disguised as an ordinary traveler, he did not start by preaching dense Marxist tracts on historical materialism. Instead, he sat down with the miners in their squalid shacks, shared their meager bowls of rice, listened to their grievances, and asked them simple, piercing questions about who was stealing the fruits of their sweat. Working alongside fellow dedicated organizers like Lai Listen and Liu Shaoqi, Mao helped establish night schools for the miners and their children. These schools served a dual purpose. They taught illiterate workers how to read and write, while subtly introducing them to the concepts of class solidarity, mutual aid, and organized resistance. Mao understood that before men could fight for a political ideal, they had to believe that their lives mattered and that unity could protect them from tyranny. By the summer of 1922, the underground network had grown strong enough to test its strength. When the mine management refused to pay back wages and increased working hours, Mao and his comrades orchestrated a massive, disciplined strike. Over 10,000 miners walked off the job, blockaded the pits, and paralyzed the local economy. The mine owners panicked and called in government troops, threatening a bloodbath. But Mao and the Union leaders held firm, organizing public support campaigns across Hunan and mobilizing student groups to raise funds for the striking families. Facing total economic ruin and fierce solidarity, the management finally capitulated, signing a historic agreement that raised wages, improved safety conditions, and officially recognized the miners' union. It was a stunning victory, proving to Mao that organized mass action could bring the ruling class to its knees. Yet, while industrial organizing yielded results in the cities, Mao's heart and analytical gaze remained fixed on the rural villages. In 1923, as political turmoil deepened across China with the warlord infighting and the uneasy alliance between the Chinese Communist Party and Sun Yat-sen's Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, Mao was called to Shanghai to attend the Third National Congress of the CCP. The party leadership, heavily influenced by Soviet advisors from the Communist International, Comintern, insisted that the Communists must subordinate their independent goals and merge into the Kuomintang to help complete the National Democratic Revolution against foreign imperialists and northern warlords. Mao had serious reservations about abandoning the political independence of the working class, but he recognized the practical necessity of the united front and was elected to the party's central committee. He spent the next few years shuttling between Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Changsha, working within the Kuomintang bureaucracy, organizing peasant unions, and witnessing firsthand the explosive potential simmering in the agricultural provinces. By 1925, the pressure cooker of Chinese politics burst open with the May 30th movement, sparked by British police firing on striking textile workers in Shanghai. The massacre ignited a wave of anti-imperialist protests across the entire nation. Mao, who had returned to his home province of Hunan to recuperate from exhaustion, found himself swept up in a new wave of revolutionary fervor. He realized that the peasantry of Hunan was waking up from centuries of passive endurance. Across the countryside, peasants were forming peasant associations, refusing to pay extortionate rents to tyrannical landlords, and demanding social justice. In early 1927, Mao undertook an extensive, boots-on-the-ground investigation of the peasant movement in 5 counties of Hunan. He walked hundreds of miles through rural roads, interviewing local farmers, village elders, poor peasants, and local activists, taking meticulous notes on their demands and actions. The result of this journey was one of the most important and radical documents in modern Chinese history, the report on an investigation of the peasant movement in Hunan. In this fiery essay, Mao decisively broke with orthodox Marxist-Leninist dogma, which viewed the urban industrial proletariat as the sole revolutionary class. He famously proclaimed that the peasantry constituted the main force of the revolution. "A revolution is not a dinner party," Mao wrote, defending the violent uprisings of the poor peasants against the local bullies and bad gentry. He argued that the peasantry was rising up to overthrow the 4 thick ropes binding them: political authority, clan authority, religious authority, and for women, the authority of the husband. Where urban intellectuals saw chaos and excess, Mao saw revolutionary justice, famously declaring that, to put it bluntly, it is necessary to create a brief reign of terror in every rural area. Correctness must be associated with a certain degree of terror, otherwise it is impossible to suppress the activities of the counter-revolutionaries. Just as Mao's vision of rural revolution was reaching its intellectual peak, the fragile alliance between the communists and the nationalists shattered in a river of blood. Following the death of Sun Yat-sen in 1925, leadership of the Kuomintang had fallen to Chiang Kai-shek, an ambitious military commander deeply suspicious of communist ambitions. On April 12, 1927, Chiang launched a sudden, brutal purge of the communists in Shanghai. Armed gangsters, secret police, and nationalist troops raided union halls and communist offices, slaughtering thousands of workers, intellectuals, and party members in a coordinated massacre. Similar purges quickly followed in Guangzhou, Wuhan, and other major cities, decimating the urban infrastructure of the Chinese Communist Party and driving the survivors underground or into hiding. The catastrophe left the communist leadership reeling. Following Soviet directives, the party attempted desperate, ill-fated urban uprisings, such as the Nanchang Uprising and the Autumn Harvest Uprising, throwing poorly armed workers and peasant militias against heavily fortified cities. Mao was put in charge of organizing the Autumn Harvest Uprising in Hunan in September 1927. He mobilized a ragtag peasant army, miners, and sympathetic soldiers known as the First Division of the Workers and Peasants' Revolutionary Army. The plan was to capture Changsha and spark a regional revolution. But the mission was a disaster from the start. The ragtag army lacked proper weapons, military training, and coordination. As they advanced toward the city, they were ambushed and decimated by superior nationalist forces. Desertions mounted, casualties piled high, and Mao himself was briefly captured by local militia. Only through quick thinking, a well-timed bribe, and sheer luck did Mao manage to slip away from his captors into the surrounding woods, narrowly escaping execution. Standing amidst the smoking ruins of his failed uprising, with his army shattered and his party decimated, Mao faced the defining crisis of his life. The urban strategy dictated by Moscow had led the communist movement to the brink of total extinction. It was at this moment of profound despair that Mao made a revolutionary pivot that would change the course of world history. Gathering the few hundred starving, exhausted survivors of the Autumn Harvest Uprising, he turned his back on the cities and led his men deep into the rugged, heavily forested mountains of the Jinggang Mountains on the border of Hunan and Jiangxi provinces. Jinggangshan was a natural fortress, isolated, heavily forested, and virtually impenetrable to conventional armies. Here, away from the prying eyes of the nationalist secret police and the unrealistic directives of urban-focused party leaders, Mao began to forge a completely new model of warfare and revolution. He understood that a small, weak revolutionary force could not defeat a well-equipped enemy in open positional warfare. Instead, he formulated the foundational principles of guerrilla warfare, later immortalized in his famous tactical maxims. The enemy advances, we retreat. The enemy camps, we harass. The enemy tires, we attack. The enemy retreats, we pursue. In the misty peaks and isolated valleys of Jinggangshan, Mao combined military strategy with radical land reform. He confiscated the land of the wealthy landlords and redistributed it equally among the poor peasants who tilled the soil. This policy won the absolute loyalty of the local rural population, transforming ordinary peasants into dedicated soldiers and intelligence gatherers who would hide the Red Army in plain sight, feed the troops, and carry supplies up steep mountain paths. Whenever the nationalist forces launched encirclement campaigns to wipe out the mountain base, the local peasants acted as the eyes and ears of the communists, leading the enemy into traps while the Red Army melted away into the forests. It was also during this tumultuous period in the mountains that Mao met Zhu De, a brilliant, battle-hardened military commander who brought his own disciplined troops to join forces with Mao's guerrilla fighters. The partnership of Mao and Zhu became the legendary cornerstone of the Chinese Red Army, combining Mao's political genius and strategic vision with Zhu De's military tactical brilliance. Together, They established strict rules of conduct for their soldiers, known as the 3 main rules of discipline and the 8 points for attention, which forbade soldiers from taking even a single needle or thread from the common people, ensuring that the Red Army was seen as a protector rather than an invading force. By the late 1920s, the Jingangshan base had expanded, drawing in other guerrilla bands, deserters from the nationalist army, and radicalized peasants from surrounding provinces. Despite ongoing internal party struggles, ideological purges, and constant military pressure from Chiang Kai-shek's armies, Mao had successfully forged a new path. He had transformed himself from an urban agitator and library assistant into a master guerrilla leader, proving that the future of the Chinese Revolution lay not in the smokestacks of Shanghai, but in the muddy furrows of the countryside and the barrel of a peasant gun. The smoke of the mountain battles in Jiangxi had barely cleared when a new, terrifying crisis descended upon the Chinese Communist Party. By the early 1930s, Mao Zedong and his military partner, Zhu De, had successfully built the Jiangxi Soviet, a sprawling rural base area where millions of peasants lived under communist administration, redistributed land, and formed their own local governments. But Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist government viewed this defiant red state as a mortal cancer eating away at the republic. Chiang launched a series of massive, brutal encirclement campaigns, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of well-armed troops backed by foreign advisors and air support to crush the communist enclave once and for all. For the first 4 campaigns, Mao's brilliant guerrilla tactics, luring the enemy deep into unfamiliar territory, mobilizing the peasant population, and striking only when the enemy was exhausted, triumphed, shattering the nationalist offensives and expanding the Red Territory. However, Mao's political fortunes took a disastrous turn with the arrival of a new faction within the communist leadership. A group of young, Moscow-trained Chinese intellectuals known as the 28 Bolsheviks, led by figures like Bo Gu and backed by the Comintern's German military advisor Otto Braun, seized control of the party apparatus. Smug in their theoretical purity and disdainful of Mao's rural, peasant-based pragmatism, these leaders dismissed guerrilla warfare as backward and amateurish. They demanded that the Red Army adopt conventional European military tactics, meet the nationalist forces head-on in fixed positional warfare, and defend every inch of territory. Mao argued passionately against this suicidal strategy, warning that a small, lightly armed peasant army could never win a conventional slugfest against Chiang's modern divisions. For his defiance, Mao was stripped of his military command, sidelined from major decision-making, and placed under political surveillance, suffering from a bout of malaria while the party leadership steered the revolution toward catastrophe. By the autumn of 1933, Chiang Kai-shek launched his 5th encirclement campaign, mobilizing a staggering 500,000 troops equipped with modern artillery, blockhouses, and air power. Rejecting Mao's mobile defense strategy, Otto Braun and the party leadership ordered the Red Army to build fixed fortifications and fight a war of attrition along the borders of the Jiangxi Soviet. It was a bloodbath. Wave after wave of communist soldiers were thrown against nationalist lines in suicidal frontal assaults. Casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. Supplies ran critically low, and the economic blockade imposed by nationalist troops created severe shortages of food, salt, and medicine. By the summer of 1934, the situation in Jiangxi had become entirely untenable. The base was collapsing from within, and the remaining forces faced total annihilation if they stayed. Secretly, the party leadership began planning a desperate escape, deciding to abandon their home base and retreat into the unknown. In October 1934, under the cover of darkness, roughly 85,000 soldiers, party cotters, and auxiliary personnel, along with a precious few women who shared the harrowing journey, began what would become one of the most mythic and grueling military retreats in human history, the Long March. They carried with them printing presses, heavy machinery disassembled into pieces, government archives, and whatever supplies could fit on their backs. At the start, the retreat was heavily mismanaged. The leadership tried to move a massive, cumbersome column laden with heavy baggage through nationalist blockades, resulting in catastrophic losses. At the Battle of Xiang River in November and December 1934, nationalist forces ambushed the retreating column, slaughtering over 40,000 communist troops in a week of vicious fighting. The red waters of the river literally ran red with blood. Disillusionment, despair, and exhaustion swept through the ranks. Soldiers began to question the competence of the leadership that had led them from the relative safety of Jiangxi into this nightmare. It was during this dark nadir of the retreat, in January 1935, as the battered column captured the historic town of Zunyi in Guizhou province, that a pivotal political showdown took place. Sensing the total bankruptcy of the current leadership, veteran military commanders and disgruntled cotters rallied around Mao Zedong. At an expanded meeting of the Politburo known as the Zunyi Conference, Mao delivered a scathing critique of Bo, Gu, and Otto Braun's military strategies, pointing out how their dogmatic adherence to foreign doctrines had brought the party to the brink of destruction. The gathering agreed. The leadership was reshuffled, and Mao Zedong was restored to positions of supreme authority, emerging as the undisputed political and military leader of the Chinese Communist Party. For the first time, the party had broken free from blind obedience to Moscow's directives, placing its fate in the hands of a leader who understood the unique realities of Chinese soil. Under Mao's renewed leadership, the character of the Long March transformed. The massive, slow-moving column was broken down into smaller, highly mobile units that could deceive the pursuing nationalist armies through constant feints, sudden direction changes, and forced marches. What followed was a legendary odyssey across some of the most treacherous, forbidding terrain on Earth. The Red Army marched through the frozen, snow-swept mountains of Yunnan and Sichuan, where thin air, bitter cold, and starvation claimed thousands of lives. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags and old animal skins, chewing on leather belts and wild roots when the grain ran out. They crossed roaring, ice-cold rivers under enemy fire, most famously at the Looting Bridge, where a vanguard of 22 brave volunteers swung across iron chains dangling over a raging torrent while enemy planks burned beneath them. Beyond the mountains and rivers lay the vast, treacherous marshes known as the Tibetan grasslands, a vast, spongy wasteland of sucking mud, stagnant, poisonous water, and freezing rain where there was no dry land to sleep on and no wood to build a fire. Hundreds of soldiers sank into the boggy mud, never to emerge, while others succumbed to disease and exhaustion. Yet, through sheer willpower, ideological fervor, and the relentless drive instilled by Mao and his commanders, the survivors pressed onward. They fought countless skirmishes against regional warlords, local Tibetan tribesmen, and relentless nationalist pursuers. By the time the exhausted, ragged remnants of the Red Army finally reached the safety of the communist base in northern Shaanxi province in October 1935, a full year after leaving Jiangxi, over 90% of those who started had perished along the way, victims of combat, cold, hunger, and disease. Though the physical toll was staggering, the Long March became the foundational myth and spiritual crucible of the Chinese Communist Party. It forged a hardened core of fanatically loyal revolutionaries who had shared near-death experiences and emerged unbroken. It proved to the Chinese people that the communists possessed superhuman endurance and an unshakable will to survive. More importantly, it cemented Mao Zedong's absolute supremacy over the party, turning him from a disputed factional leader into an almost mythic figure whose personal authority was now synonymous with the revolution itself. From the dust and caves of northern Shaanxi, Mao and his surviving comrades began to plan their next great offensive, knowing that the trials of the Long March were only the prelude to the ultimate struggle for the soul of China. The dry, dusty caves of Yan'an in northern Shaanxi province became the unlikely cradle of a renewed revolution. After the grueling ordeal of the Long March, the surviving forces of the Chinese Communist Party were battered, exhausted, and numerically weak. Yet they had found a sanctuary. Surrounded by barren hills and lowest plateaus, Mao Zedong and his corps commanders set about rebuilding their shattered army and party apparatus. They lived humbly in cave dwellings carved into the hillsides, eating coarse millet, wearing patched uniforms, and sharing the hardships of the local peasantry. But beneath this Spartan exterior, a fierce, calculating energy pulsed through the camp. Mao understood that the communists could not survive another direct assault by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces. They needed time to heal, time to grow, and above all, a profound shift in the political landscape of China. That shift arrived from an external force, the aggressive, brutal expansion of Imperial Japan. For years, Japanese military forces had been encroaching upon Chinese territory, seizing Manchuria in 1931 and pushing deeper into northern and eastern China. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, obsessed with its primary goal of eradicating the communists, had largely adopted a policy of appeasement toward Japanese aggression, famously remarking that the Japanese are a disease of the skin, but the communists are a disease of the heart. This policy infuriated the Chinese public, students, intellectuals, and even many patriotic commanders within Chiang's own military, who believed that the nation's immediate survival depended on uniting against the foreign invader rather than fighting a bloody civil war. Mao Zedong seized upon this surging wave of anti-Japanese nationalism with political brilliance. He framed the Communist Party as the true defender of the Chinese nation, proposing a united front against Japanese imperialism. The turning point in this strategy came in December 1936 during the dramatic Xi'an incident. Chiang Kai-shek flew to Xi'an to oversee a final campaign to wipe out the communists in the northwest. Instead, his own generals, led by Zhang Zuoliang and Yang Hucheng, who were desperate to turn the nation's guns against Japan, placed Chiang under arrest in a daring midnight raid. The rebel generals contacted the communists, asking what should be done with the captured nationalist leader. In a decision that changed the course of Chinese history, Mao and the party leadership, acting on advice from Moscow, counseled against executing Chiang. They realized that executing Chiang would plunge the nationalist camp into chaotic factionalism, rendering it useless as an ally, and that a united front under a coerced Chiang was the only viable path to survival and ultimate victory. A delegation led by Zhu Enlai flew to Xi'an to negotiate a peaceful resolution. Chiang Kai-shek was forced to agree to halt the civil war and form a fragile, uneasy alliance with the Chinese Communist Party to fight the Japanese invaders. The Second United Front was born. For Mao, this alliance was a strategic masterstroke. It granted the Red Army official recognition, halted the relentless nationalist encirclement campaigns, and provided a protective political umbrella under which the communists could expand their military forces and territorial control without appearing as outlaws. As full-scale war erupted following the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July 1937, Japanese armies swept across eastern China, capturing major cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and the nationalist capital of Nanjing, where they perpetrated unspeakable atrocities during the infamous Rape of Nanjing, while Chiang Kai-shek's conventional armies bore the brunt of the initial Japanese onslaught, retreating deep into the interior and establishing a wartime capital in Chongqing. Mao deployed a completely different strategy. He knew that the Red Army could not defeat modern Japanese divisions in conventional positional warfare. Instead, he ordered his commanders to return to the rural heartlands behind enemy lines in northern and central China, practicing what he termed protracted People's War. Mao's military strategy during the anti-Japanese war was a masterpiece of guerrilla cunning. The Communist 8th Route Army and the new 4th Army melted into the rural countryside, blending seamlessly with the peasant population just as fish swim in the sea. They did not try to hold fixed cities or territory against Japanese tanks, artillery, and air superiority. Instead, they waged a relentless war of attrition, ambushing supply convoys, cutting railway lines, blowing up bridges, launching sudden night raids, and disappearing back into the mist before the enemy could retaliate. Mao famously summarized this tactical doctrine in 4 simple phrases. When the enemy advances, we retreat. When the enemy halts, we harass. When the enemy tires, we attack. When the enemy retreats, we pursue. Beyond military tactics, Mao recognized that the true strength of the revolution lay in mobilizing the peasantry through social and economic reform. In the base areas established behind Japanese lines, the Communists implemented moderate, calculated land policies. Instead of outright confiscation and violent execution of all landlords, which might alienate wealthier peasants and disrupt wartime production, they introduced rent and interest reduction. Landlords were pressured to lower rents for tenant farmers, and high-interest debts owed to rural moneylenders were canceled. These popular reforms dramatically improved the economic well-being of millions of peasants, winning their fierce loyalty and transforming them into active participants in the war effort. Peasants formed local militias, served as scouts, carried supplies, and gathered intelligence on Japanese troop movements, while the nationalist armies suffered from rampant corruption, low morale, hyperinflation, and brutal conscription methods that alienated the rural population. The communist base areas fostered a spirit of egalitarianism, discipline, and patriotic service. Mao used this period not only to fight the Japanese, but also to consolidate his absolute ideological control over the party. Between 1942 and 1944, he launched the Yan'an Rectification movement, a massive ideological education and thought reform campaign. Through intensive study of Marxist-Leninist texts adapted to Chinese conditions, self-criticism sessions, and the purging of rivals who favored Soviet-style orthodox dogma, Mao systematically eradicated dissent. By the end of the rectification movement, the party was utterly unified around Mao Zedong thought, viewing Mao not just as a political leader, but as an infallible ideological prophet. Throughout the war years, the uneasy alliance between the communists and the nationalists was constantly strained by mutual suspicion, territorial disputes, and occasional armed clashes. Chiang Kai-shek imposed a strict economic and military blockade around the communist base areas, hoping to starve them into submission, while saving his own best troops to fight the communists after the Japanese were defeated. Despite this sabotage, the communists flourished. By the time World War II drew to a close in August 1945, the Red Army had grown from a ragged force of a few tens of thousands into a formidable military machine, boasting nearly 1 million regular soldiers and over 2 million militia members, controlling vast swaths of rural territory in northern and central China. The sudden surrender of Japan in August 1945, triggered by the atomic bombings and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, plunged China into a critical moment of decision. The country stood at a historic crossroads: peace through coalition government or total civil war. American diplomats, led by General George Marshall, attempted to mediate a peace settlement between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, bringing them together for tense negotiations in Chongqing. Mao even flew to Chongqing, showing immense personal courage by entering the heart of nationalist territory to negotiate. But neither side was willing to compromise on ultimate power. Chiang demanded that the Communist Army be completely disbanded and integrated into the nationalist military, a demand that Mao knew would spell certain destruction for the party. By the summer of 1946, the fragile veneer of peace shattered entirely, and the Chinese Civil War resumed with devastating fury. At the outset, most international observers, including American and Soviet leaders, predicted a swift and decisive victory for Chiang Kai-shek. The nationalists possessed an overwhelming numerical advantage, boasting over 4 million well-equipped troops supported by billions of dollars in American military aid, modern air forces, heavy artillery, and control of China's major cities and industrial centers. The Communists, by contrast, were lightly armed, possessed virtually no heavy artillery or air support, and controlled mostly rural, impoverished areas. Yet Chiang's apparent strength masked fatal structural weaknesses. The nationalist government was rotting from within due to rampant corruption, severe economic collapse, hyperinflation that rendered paper currency entirely worthless, and widespread war weariness. Millions of ordinary Chinese citizens, exhausted by decades of war, corruption, and economic chaos, completely lost faith in the nationalist regime. Conscripted soldiers deserted in droves, often surrendering to the communists without firing a shot, eager to escape the brutal abuse of nationalist officers. Mao and his military commander, Zhu De, exploited these weaknesses with brilliant strategic execution. Recognizing that they could not match the nationalists in positional trench warfare, they initially adopted a mobile defense strategy, trading space for time, evacuating cities when necessary, and luring nationalist armies deep into hostile rural territory, where they could be isolated and annihilated piecemeal. A crucial turning point occurred in the northeast region of Manchuria, where Soviet forces had handed over vast stores of captured Japanese weaponry to the advancing communist forces, now renamed the People's Liberation Army, PLA. By 1948, the tide of the Civil War had completely turned. The PLA transitioned from guerrilla warfare to conventional mobile warfare, launching major campaigns that shattered the core of the nationalist military. The Shaoshan campaign in Manchuria resulted in the destruction of over 400,000 nationalist troops and brought the entire industrial northeast under communist control. This was followed by the Huihai campaign in late 1948 and early 1949, a colossal clash involving over 1 million troops on both sides across the plains of east-central China. Through brilliant envelopment tactics, superior morale, and overwhelming peasant logistical support, where millions of peasants using wooden carts, wheelbarrows, and carrying poles supplied the PLA with food and ammunition across hundreds of miles, the communists surrounded and annihilated entire nationalist armies. The final collapse came swiftly. In January 1949, after a fierce siege, the PLA entered the ancient capital of Beijing without a major battle after the local nationalist garrison surrendered. The ping-pong of artillery gave way to the triumphant march of victorious peasant soldiers through streets lined with cheering citizens. Chiang Kai-shek and the remnants of his shattered government fled across the Taiwan Strait to the island of Taipei, protected by the U.S. Navy, leaving the mainland entirely in communist hands. Mao Zedong stood on the threshold of absolute victory. The decades of bitter struggle, from the mountain hideouts of Jinggangshan and the bloody trials of the Long March, to the grueling years of anti-Japanese resistance and the sweeping campaigns of the Civil War, had finally culminated in triumph. The road of blood, sweat, and tactical genius had brought Mao to the summit of power, ready to reshape the ancient civilization of China from the ground up. The autumn air over Beijing carried the crisp promise of a new era. On October 1, 1949, from the towering heights of the Tiananmen rostrum, Mao Zedong looked out over a vast, roaring sea of hundreds of thousands of workers, peasants, soldiers, and students. The square was a sea of red banners, bright cloth, and hopeful faces. When Mao stepped up to the microphone, his heavy Hunan accent rang out across the ancient plaza with words that echoed around the globe. The Chinese people have stood up. With those historic syllables, the People's Republic of China was officially born, bringing a dramatic and thunderous end to over a century of foreign humiliation, civil war, warlordism, and imperial collapse. The century of humiliation marked by the Opium Wars, unequal treaties, foreign concessions, brutal Japanese invasion, and catastrophic domestic corruption was finally over. A new socialist dawn had broken over the Middle Kingdom, and Mao Zedong was undisputed master of the largest nation on earth. Yet, the jubilation of that crisp October day masked a staggering, monumental reality. The triumph on the battlefield was complete, but the nation that Mao and the Chinese Communist Party inherited was a shattered, bleeding husk. Decades of unceasing warfare, spanning the Northern Expedition, the bloody extermination campaigns of the nationalists, the horrific destruction of the anti-Japanese war, and the devastating final clash of the Chinese Civil War, had left China's economy in absolute ruins. Agricultural production had plummeted to historic lows. Fields lay fallow, irrigation systems were broken down, and rural villages were depopulated by death and flight. Modern industry was practically non-existent outside of a few coastal enclaves, and even those factories had been gutted by retreating nationalist forces or damaged by Allied bombing. Hyperinflation had utterly destroyed the value of money. People traded goods with silver coins, grain, or cloth because paper currency was literally worth less than the paper it was printed on. Disease, malnutrition, and widespread opium addiction plagued the cities and countryside alike, while millions of demobilized soldiers, bandits, and rival factions roamed the land. The task of governing and rebuilding was immense, far more difficult than winning military victories. The immediate priority for the newly formed Central People's Government was total political consolidation and the establishment of strict administrative control over a massive, fractured territory. Mao and his core leadership did not waste a moment. They set up a centralized socialist state apparatus, combining the party, the military, and the civil administration into a tightly disciplined hierarchy. Beijing was designated as the national capital, reclaiming its ancient imperial glory under a revolutionary banner. Regional bureaus were established to govern vast geographic zones, staffed by seasoned military commanders and dedicated party cadres who enforced party directives with unwavering loyalty. The People's Liberation Army, which had grown into a massive force of millions, was deployed across the country to eradicate remaining bandit groups, suppress anti-communist guerrilla resistance in the south and west, and secure vulnerable borders. Within a remarkably short span of time, the communists achieved what the Qing dynasty and the nationalist regime had failed to do for decades. They unified mainland China under a single, highly centralized authority. At the heart of Mao's strategy for transforming society and securing the loyalty of the masses was the radical restructuring of the rural economy through land reform. For thousands of years, China's peasantry had groaned under the oppressive yoke of landlords, gentry, and moneylenders, who owned the vast majority of arable land, while extracting crushing rents and exorbitant interest rates. Mao knew that if the Communist Party wanted to build a stable foundation of power, it had to fulfill its historic promise of land to the tillers. Beginning in the winter of 1949 and rolling out rapidly across the country, land reform teams composed of party cadres and peasant activists were dispatched to every village. These teams organized struggle sessions, intense public trials where local landlords were accused of exploitation, abuse, and crimes against the peasantry. The atmosphere was charged with revolutionary fervor and class hatred. Landlords were stripped of their land, draft animals, farming tools, and surplus homes, which were then redistributed among poor and landless peasants. In many cases, the process turned violently lethal, with hundreds of thousands of landlords and wealthy elites executed or beaten to death by angry mobs. While this brutal violence horrified observers and shattered traditional rural social structures, it achieved its immediate political goal. It bound the peasantry to the communist regime with bonds of shared blood and newly acquired property, creating a fiercely loyal constituency that viewed Mao as their ultimate savior. Simultaneously, the new government launched sweeping campaigns to eradicate what it termed feudal remnants and social evils. Prostitution, which had flourished amid poverty and war, was systematically banned, and brothels were closed down while sex workers were sent to re-education and rehabilitation centers. Opium production and addiction, a curse that had plagued China since the 19th century, were attacked with terrifying efficiency. Drug traffickers were publicly executed, and addicts were subjected to harsh, involuntary detoxification programs that successfully wiped out the trade within a few short years. Organized crime syndicates, secret societies, and criminal gangs that had controlled urban underworlds for generations were smashed through mass arrests and public trials. Women's rights underwent a profound legal revolution with the passage of the marriage law of 1950, which abolished arranged marriages, child betrothals, concubinage, and the purchase of brides, while granting women the equal right to divorce, own property, and choose their own spouses. While traditional patriarchal customs proved stubborn and difficult to eradicate overnight, this legislation signaled a radical departure from millennia of Confucian tradition. While tackling domestic reconstruction, Mao and the party leadership could not ignore the hostile international environment. The Cold War was freezing the globe into opposing capitalist and socialist blocs, and the victory of Chinese communism sent shockwaves through Western capitals, particularly Washington. The United States, which had heavily backed Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime with billions of dollars, refused to recognize the People's Republic of China, maintaining diplomatic relations with the exiled nationalist government in Taiwan, and imposing a strict trade and economic embargo against the mainland. Mao, deeply distrustful of Western imperialism and determined to protect China's sovereignty, declared that China would lean to one side, aligning itself firmly with the Soviet Union and the socialist camp. In early 1950, Mao traveled to Moscow for historic negotiations with Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, resulting in the signing of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. Though the relationship between Beijing and Moscow was fraught with underlying tensions, ideological rivalries, and mutual suspicion, the treaty provided China with vital Soviet financial credits, industrial machinery, and thousands of technical advisors who began helping Beijing plan its first steps toward modern industrialization. Almost immediately, this fragile international standing was tested by the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950. As North Korean troops invaded the South, United Nations forces led by the United States intervened decisively, pushing North Korean forces all the way back to the Chinese border along the Yalu River by the autumn of 1950. For Mao and the Politburo, the presence of hostile American forces right on China's northeastern doorstep posed an intolerable strategic threat. They feared that a U.S.-dominated Korea could serve as a staging ground for a future invasion of the newly born socialist state, or provide a base for resurging nationalist forces. Despite the warnings of military commanders, who pointed out the vast technological and industrial superiority of the United States, which possessed atomic weapons, a modern air force, and total naval dominance, Mao made the fateful decision to intervene. In October 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, renamed the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, secretly crossed the Yalu River under cover of darkness and night marches. What followed was a brutal, grinding military stalemate that lasted for nearly 3 years. The Chinese forces, fighting in the freezing winter mountains of Korea with primitive equipment, thin uniforms, and scarce ammunition, launched massive human wave assaults against UN positions. In fierce battles around the Shaoshan Reservoir and across snowy river valleys, the Chinese inflicted heavy casualties on American and Allied forces, pushing them back down the Korean peninsula and stabilizing the front roughly around the 38th parallel. The human cost to China was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers died in combat, froze to death in the bitter sub-zero temperatures, or succumbed to disease. Among the fallen was Mao's own eldest son, Mao Zedong, who was killed by an American airstrike in Korea, a personal tragedy that deeply grieved the chairman. Yet, despite the staggering casualties, the political impact of the Korean War on domestic China was immense. The war was framed by state propaganda as a heroic defense of the motherland against American aggression. It galvanized nationalist pride, united the populace behind the flag, and proved to the world that China could fight the strongest military power on earth to a standstill. Domestically, the government used the wartime atmosphere to launch aggressive suppression campaigns against real and imagined counter-revolutionaries, spies, and class enemies, arresting and executing hundreds of thousands of people in a wave of political terror that cemented party control. With the Korean armistice signed in 1953, Beijing turned its full attention to economic reconstruction and the transition towards socialism. China launched its first 5-year plan in 1953, closely modeled on the Soviet system of centralized state planning. The primary focus was placed on heavy industry, coal, steel, electric power, machine building, and petroleum extraction, at the expense of consumer goods and light agriculture. Soviet engineers and technicians poured into Chinese cities, overseeing the construction of massive industrial complexes, steel mills, and railway lines in cities like Wuhan, Anshan, and Beitou. Smokestacks pierced the sky, and urban working classes swelled as millions of peasants migrated to cities to labor in state-owned factories. For the first time in modern history, China was building a heavy industrial base from scratch. In tandem with industrialization, the leadership began transforming the rural economy from private peasant farming into collective agriculture. Remembering the Soviet Union's disastrous forced collectivization under Stalin, Mao initially advocated a gradual, step-by-step approach. Peasants were first encouraged to form mutual aid teams, pooling their draft animals and tools during peak farming seasons. These groups were then amalgamated into lower-level agricultural producers' cooperatives, where land remained privately owned but was farmed collectively, with profits divided based on labor and land contributed. By the mid-1950s, however, Mao grew impatient with the slow pace of rural transformation. Convinced that the peasantry was naturally eager for full socialism, and that collective farming was the only way to generate the agricultural surpluses necessary to feed the growing industrial cities and fund heavy machinery imports, Mao pushed for a dramatic acceleration. By 1956, the cooperative movement was supercharged into advanced agricultural producers' cooperatives, where private ownership of land and major farming implements was abolished entirely. Land, tools, and draft animals were turned over to the collective, and peasants were paid in work points based on the quantity and quality of labor they performed. Alongside the countryside, urban private industry and commerce were systematically nationalized through a process known as joint state-private ownership. Capitalists and merchants were stripped of their independent businesses, which were absorbed into state-controlled enterprises, with former owners receiving modest fixed interest payments. By the end of 1956, the transformation of China's economic structure was virtually complete. Private capitalism had been eradicated, individual peasant farming had been replaced by collective agriculture, and the commanding heights of the economy were firmly in the hands of the party state. As the economic transformation unfolded, Mao turned his attention to the ideological health of the party and the nation. Intellectuals, writers, and scientists had expressed growing unease with the rigid ideological controls, censorship, and bureaucratic stifling that accompanied party rule. Seeking to harness the creative energies of intellectuals for national development and hoping to flush out hidden critics of the regime, Mao launched the famous 100 Flowers campaign in 1956, famously declaring, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend." For many months, intellectuals remained cautious and silent, remembering the bloody purges of previous years. But as Mao and party leaders repeatedly urged openness, a torrent of sharp, bitter criticism erupted across the country. University students, professors, journalists, and Democratic Party members began openly attacking the monopoly of the Communist Party, denouncing bureaucratic corruption, demanding freedom of speech, questioning Marxist orthodoxy, and criticizing Mao himself. Alarmed by the sheer ferocity and depth of the discontent, Mao and the party leadership abruptly reversed course in the summer of 1957. What began as a campaign of intellectual encouragement transformed overnight into a ferocious political counteroffensive known as the anti-rightist campaign. Hundreds of thousands of intellectuals, writers, scientists, and professionals who had dared to voice criticism were labeled as rightists, traitors to the socialist cause. They were publicly humiliated, stripped of their jobs and university positions, expelled from the party, and sent away to remote labor camps in the barren wastes of the Gobi Desert or the frozen rust belt of the Northeast for brutal re-education through labor. Many endured years of physical abuse, psychological torture, and starvation. Thousands perished. The 100 Flowers campaign and its brutal aftermath marked a crucial turning point. It silenced independent intellectual thought in China for a generation, instilled a pervasive culture of fear and sycophancy among the educated classes, and convinced Mao that class struggle was far from over and that internal enemies were constantly plotting to restore capitalism. By the end of 1957, China stood at the threshold of a new, radical chapter in its revolutionary journey. The first five-year plan had achieved impressive growth in heavy industry, but Mao was dissatisfied with the plodding, bureaucratic pace of Soviet-style development. He believed that China's greatest asset was not machines or foreign capital, but its immense, inexhaustible population of 600 million peasants. Convinced of his own infallibility and intoxicated by the revolutionary romanticism that had brought him from the caves of Yan'an to the halls of power in Beijing, Mao began dreaming of a breathtaking leap that would bypass traditional stages of economic development and propel China directly into true communist society. The foundations of the new socialist state had been laid in blood, sweat, and steel, but the chairman was already plotting a far more radical revolution that would test the endurance of the Chinese people to its absolute limit. The year 1957 ended with a dark cloud hanging over China's intellectual and political landscape. The sudden crackdown of the anti-rightist campaign had crushed any hopes of political openness. Hundreds of thousands of the nation's brightest minds, writers, scientists, professors, and students, had been labeled as class enemies, stripped of their livelihoods, and banished to labor camps. But for Mao Zedong, this brutal silencing of dissent was only the beginning. The chairman believed that the revolution could never stand still. He was convinced that society was locked in a permanent, relentless struggle between the socialist path and the capitalist road. If the party relaxed its grip even for a moment, counter-revolutionary forces would rise up and destroy everything that had been built since 1949. Mao's absolute authority within the party was now virtually unchallenged, though beneath the surface, subtle tensions were beginning to brew among other top leaders. Pragmatists within the party, such as Liu Shaoqi and Zhu Enlai, were acutely aware of the exhaustion gripping the country. They knew that the frantic pace of the preceding years, land reform, the Korean War, the socialist transformation of industry, and the suppression campaigns, had taken a severe toll on the population. They favored a period of consolidation, rational economic planning, and careful administrative management, following closely the advice of Soviet experts. They wanted to build factories that worked efficiently, produce consumer goods that people actually needed, and let the weary population catch its breath. But Mao rejected this cautious, bureaucratic approach with utter contempt. He viewed Soviet-style revisionism as timid and lifeless. To Mao, the true engine of history was not steel production quotas or bureaucratic planning boards, but the boundless, revolutionary enthusiasm of the masses. He believed that ordinary Chinese peasants and workers, once awakened and organized, could achieve the impossible. If the Soviet Union took decades to industrialize, China would do it in a fraction of the time through sheer human will, mass mobilization, and unyielding ideological fervor. This romantic, utopian vision set the stage for a series of aggressive domestic campaigns designed to purge lingering opposition, accelerate economic output through sheer force, and tighten ideological control over every single aspect of Chinese life. The first major focus of this renewed push for power was the completion of agricultural collectivization and the tightening of local party control through the socialist education movement and local rectification campaigns. While the advanced agricultural producers' cooperatives had been established by 1956, Mao and radical party ideologues felt that rural society was still infected with capitalist habits and individualistic desires. Peasants still secretly longed to work their own small plots of land, Local officials were sometimes accused of corruption, foot-dragging, or harboring sympathy for rich peasants. To root out these perceived threats, local party cadres were dispatched to villages with orders to wage fierce class struggle. They re-examined the class labels of every villager, dividing families into landlords, rich peasants, middle peasants, and poor peasants. Anyone suspected of resisting collective work or hiding grain was publicly denounced, humiliated, and subjected to struggle sessions. This constant surveillance and engineered paranoia ensured that rural compliance remained absolute, laying the groundwork for even more radical experiments to come. Simultaneously, the regime unleashed a massive public health and sanitation crusade known as the Patriotic Health Campaign, which was heavily tied to ideological mobilization. Billed as a war against the four pests, rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows, this campaign demonstrated both the immense mobilizing power of the party state and its dangerous disregard for ecological balance. Millions of citizens, from schoolchildren to elderly grandmothers, were mobilized across cities and villages to beat pots and pans, wave flags, and shout endlessly to prevent sparrows from landing, forcing the birds to fly until they dropped dead from exhaustion in the fields. While the campaign succeeded in drastically reducing the population of certain disease-carrying insects and rodents, the near-total eradication of sparrows severely disrupted the natural food chain, allowing crop-destroying locusts and insects to multiply unchecked in later years, contributing directly to future agricultural disasters. Yet, at the time, the campaign was hailed as a stunning triumph of mass organization, reinforcing Mao's belief that nature and society could be fundamentally reshaped by collective human decree. As these localized campaigns swept the country, Mao began formulating a sweeping ideological framework that would justify an even greater leap forward. He grew increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as the slow growth rate of the first five-year plan. China was still desperately poor, lagging far behind Western industrial powers, and even falling short of rapid Soviet growth. In late 1957 and early 1958, Mao launched a fierce ideological offensive within the party leadership, sidelining moderate voices who urged caution. He argued that China could walk on two legs simultaneously, developing both heavy industry and light industry, both large central enterprises and small local projects, and relying on both modern machinery and traditional indigenous methods. He coined fiery slogans calling on the Chinese people to break down superstitions, emancipate the mind, and achieve results greater, faster, better, and more economically. To ensure that no one within the party apparatus dared to oppose these ambitious plans, Mao utilized party meetings to demand absolute loyalty and ideological conformity. At the Nanning Conference in early 1958 and subsequent meetings in Chengdu, Mao sharply criticized leaders who had advocated a more moderate economic pace, accusing them of having feet like bound women who moved too slowly and lacked revolutionary courage. Intimidated by Mao's overwhelming prestige and fearful of being branded as right-wing deviationists, veteran revolutionaries and economic planners fell into line. Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi, and other leaders who harbored private doubts felt compelled to publicly support the chairman's grandiose visions. This climate of fear and uncritical obedience proved fatal, as it effectively eliminated internal checks and balances within the top leadership, leaving the nation vulnerable to unchecked utopianism. The machinery of state terror was also continuously refined and deployed to crush any potential centers of resistance. The suppression of counter-revolutionaries, which had begun in the early years of the Republic, was institutionalized through continuous political study sessions, neighborhood committees, and workplace surveillance units, known as the Danwei system. Every citizen's life was closely monitored. Dossiers dawn were compiled on individuals from their school days onward, recording their political reliability, family background, and any stray remarks they might have uttered. A person's career, housing assignment, food rations, and travel permissions were entirely dependent on the political assessment of their local party branch. This comprehensive system of social control ensured that dissent was identified and punished long before it could coalesce into organized opposition. In the cities, the suppression of private commerce and independent craftsmanship was finalized during this period. While large capitalist enterprises had been brought under joint state-private ownership by 1956, millions of small shopkeepers, peddlers, tailors, blacksmiths, and independent artisans had continued to operate on a small scale, providing vital retail and repair services to urban populations. Under the banner of eliminating capitalist remnants, these small businesses were forcibly merged into cooperative stores or absorbed directly into state commercial networks. Independent livelihoods were outlawed. Everyone was assigned to a collective enterprise or state-run unit. While this streamlined economic administration from the perspective of central planners, it destroyed the flexibility and variety of the urban service sector, turning bustling market streets into drab, bureaucratized distribution centers. Meanwhile, the party launched a massive ideological campaign aimed at transforming the very psychology of the Chinese people. Through endless study of Mao's writings, mandatory political meetings, self-criticism sessions, and public struggle rallies, citizens were taught to subordinate their personal desires, family loyalties, and individual thoughts to the collective will of the party. Traditional Confucian values of filial piety, family honor, and respect for ancestors were relentlessly attacked as feudal trash that held back socialist progress. Instead, citizens were instructed to direct their utmost loyalty toward Chairman Mao and the party. The cult of personality surrounding Mao began to take on near-religious proportions. His portraits hung in every home. His little red books of quotations were studied like sacred scripture, and his words were treated as absolute truth that could solve any scientific, technical, or economic problem. By the middle of 1958, these early political campaigns, purges, and ideological mobilizations had thoroughly transformed the internal landscape of China. The party state had achieved unprecedented levels of control over society. Independent thought had been systematically rooted out through the anti-rightist campaign. Potential economic and political rivals within the leadership had been cowed into submission. The peasantry had been locked into rigid cooperatives, and the urban population had been organized into tightly monitored state units. The entire nation was suspended in a state of high-octane revolutionary tension, waiting for the signal to move forward. Mao looked out over this disciplined, obedient, and thoroughly mobilized populace with supreme confidence. He believed that the Chinese people had been successfully forged into an invincible revolutionary weapon. The early campaigns of power had cleared away all obstacles, silenced all critics, and concentrated absolute authority in his hands. He was no longer just the leader of a victorious political party. He was viewed by millions as an infallible prophet of the modern age, capable of bending history, economics, and nature to his absolute will. As the summer of 1958 approached, Mao gave the final command to launch the most ambitious, reckless, and catastrophic economic experiment in human history, the Great Leap Forward. Unaware that this utopian dream would unleash a human tragedy of unimaginable proportions across the very land he sought to elevate. The signal was given in the summer of 1958, and with it, the quiet rhythms of rural and urban life across China were shattered forever. Mao Zedong, intoxicated by his absolute control over the party and his belief in the infinite power of human will, launched the Great Leap Forward. He was determined to bypass the traditional, slow stages of industrialization and pull China past the economic might of Great Britain and the United States in a matter of years. What followed was a frenzy of utopian engineering, forced mass labor, and fantastical economic targets that disregarded every rule of science, economics, and human endurance. The nation was transformed into a chaotic workshop of steel furnaces and giant agricultural communes, driven by a leadership that mistook ideological fervor for physical reality. The foundational building block of this mad rush was the People's Commune. Across the Chinese countryside, the smaller agricultural cooperatives that had been hastily formed over the previous years were forcibly dissolved and merged into gargantuan collectives known as communes. These were not merely economic units. They were totalizing social institutions designed to completely restructure human existence. A single commune often embraced thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of peasant households. Under this radical system, private life was effectively abolished. Family homes were emptied of cooking pots, utensils, and food stocks, as individual kitchens were declared relics of selfish bourgeois individualism. Instead, all peasants were forced to eat their meals in vast, communal dining halls where food was distributed freely, at least in the beginning, when supplies still existed. Private property was outlawed in the communes. Family plots, livestock, fruit trees, and farm tools were confiscated and handed over to collective management. Private farming was banned entirely. To maximize labor efficiency and break down traditional family structures, men and women were separated into militarized work brigades and battalions, marching to the fields with red flags flying, singing revolutionary songs, and working from dawn until deep into the night. Nurseries and kindergartens were established to care for infants and young children, allowing mothers to labor alongside men in the fields and construction sites. The elderly were herded into houses of happiness, though their care was often neglected as all available energy was poured into production. The commune system promised to usher in a communist paradise of plenty, where everything was shared and money would soon become obsolete. Instead, it dismantled the traditional safety nets of rural society and turned the countryside into a rigid, totalitarian labor camp. Simultaneously, Mao decided that China must instantly surpass Western steel production. In September 1958, the central leadership called upon the entire nation to mobilize for a massive backyard iron and steel campaign. The goal was to double China's steel output in a single year by constructing millions of small, crude blast furnaces in towns, villages, schoolyards, and urban neighborhoods. Peasants, students, office workers, and party cotters abandoned their normal duties to build these improvised brick and mud furnaces, fueling them with whatever combustible materials they could lay their hands on. When coal ran short, people stripped furniture from their homes, tore down wooden doors, and burned precious timber. When metal scrap became scarce, villagers were ordered to hand over their agricultural tools, iron pots, pans, doorknobs, window grills, and even traditional cooking woks to be melted down into pig iron. Night after night, the skies across China glowed with a fierce, eerie red light from millions of backyard fires. The noise of gongs, drums, and chanting filled the air as people worked in grueling shifts without sleep. Millions of tons of so-called steel were produced through this frenzied collective effort. But the campaign was a catastrophic economic delusion. The small backyard furnaces were incapable of reaching the high temperatures required to produce usable, high-grade steel. The resulting output was mostly brittle, low-quality pig iron full of impurities, useless for modern manufacturing or construction. Furthermore, the diversion of tens of millions of peasants away from agricultural work into furnace building meant that crops were left unattended in the fields at critical moments of the growing season. Millions of tons of grain rotted and went unharvested, while the population burned pots and pans to forge worthless lumps of slag. While this industrial farce was unfolding, the agricultural front was subjected to an equally disastrous campaign of pseudo-scientific agriculture, based on the eccentric theories of a Soviet agronomist named Trofim Lysenko, whose ideas Mao embraced with fanatical devotion. Traditional farming wisdom accumulated over millennia was dismissed as backward superstition. Instead, peasants were ordered to implement radically new, untested cultivation methods decreed by Beijing. One such method was close planting, based on the Marxist theory that plants of the same class do not compete with each other but cooperate. Peasants were forced to sow seeds 10 to 20 times denser than normal, crowding shoots so tightly together that they choked one another out, competed desperately for scarce nutrients and sunlight, and produced severely stunted yields. Another bizarre innovation was deep plowing, which involved digging up the earth to depths of 2 to 3 meters. This practice turned the fertile topsoil upside down, burying essential nutrients deep underground and bringing sterile subsoil to the surface, permanently ruining the land's fertility across vast regions. Compounding these disasters was an epidemic of hysterical lying and statistical fabrication that spread rapidly through the party hierarchy. Local party officials, desperate to please Mao and terrified of being labeled rightists or lack one acres of capitalism, began wildly inflating their crop yield reports. When a commune harvested a modest amount of grain, local cotters would report figures 10, 50, or even 100 times higher than the reality, claiming miraculous bumper crops achieved through socialist enthusiasm. These fabricated figures were eagerly accepted by provincial leaders and reported in national newspapers with blazing headlines. Believing that China was suddenly drowning in an unprecedented surplus of food, the central government drastically increased state grain procurement quotas, seizing grain based on these imaginary harvests and leaving peasants with virtually nothing to eat in their villages. Much of the supposedly abundant grain was exported abroad to pay for foreign machinery, or wasted in extravagant displays of communal feasting during the early months of the frenzy. By the winter of 1958 and into 1959, the first terrifying signs of the catastrophe began to surface. The food reserves that rural communities had relied upon for generations were completely gone, depleted by confiscatory state quotas and reckless communal consumption. In villages across Henan, Anhui, Sichuan, Shandong, and Gansu, the communal dining halls began running out of food. Peasants who had been promised a communist paradise found themselves facing empty bowls. When people tried to forage for wild herbs, bark, and roots, local party cotters often accused them of stealing socialist property and subjected them to brutal beatings and public torture. The grain that had been reported on paper did not exist in reality, but the state demands for delivery remained absolute and unyielding. As the famine deepened, local officials enforced a cruel system of control to prevent starving peasants from fleeing their starving villages. Armed militia units were stationed at roads and railway stations to check travel permits and block escape routes. Grain warehouses were heavily guarded, while thousands of people starved within sight of locked storehouses. Anyone caught whispering complaints about the food shortage or questioning the wisdom of the communes was denounced as a counter-revolutionary, stripped of their meager remaining rations, and subjected to violent struggle sessions. In many areas, party bosses prioritized the protection of their own political careers over human lives, concealing the true scale of the crisis from higher authorities and punishing anyone who dared to speak the truth about the unfolding disaster. By late 1959, the Great Leap Forward had metastasized into the worst man-made famine in human history. The human cost was staggering beyond comprehension. Entire villages were wiped out, families disintegrated as parents, driven mad by hunger, abandoned, or even consumed their own dead children in acts of sheer desperation. Corpses lay unburied along roadsides and in desolate fields because there was no one left with the strength to dig graves. In provinces like Anhui and Henan, death rates skyrocketed to apocalyptic levels, and local populations plummeted by massive percentages. Yet, inside the secure compounds of Beijing, the full horror of the disaster was slow to penetrate. Information was filtered through layers of sycophancy and fear, and Mao and his inner circle continued to insist that the Great Leap Forward was a triumph of the masses, blaming local administrative errors or hidden class enemies for the localized shortages, rather than recognizing the fatal flaws of their own utopian ideology. The Great Leap Forward exposed the terrifying vulnerability of a totalitarian state stripped of internal criticism and feedback loops. By eliminating all moderate voices during the anti-rightist purges, Mao had created an echo chamber where no one dared to contradict his grandiose delusions. The attempt to bend nature, economics, and human society to the unyielding will of a single man had resulted in profound ecological destruction, economic ruin, and the deaths of tens of millions of innocent citizens. As the bodies piled up across the Chinese countryside, the nation stood on the brink of an abyss, its revolutionary spirit battered and its population brought to its knees by the very movement that was supposed to usher in its glorious liberation. By the end of 1960, the true scale of the catastrophe that Mao Zedong had unleashed upon China could no longer be entirely hidden from the highest levels of the Communist Party. The backyard steel furnaces had cooled into heaps of useless slag. The countryside was littered with the unburied dead of the greatest man-made famine in human history, and the economy was in total ruins. Millions of peasants had starved to death, birth rates had plummeted, and morale across the entire nation was at an absolute low. Even within the inner circles of the party, where fear of Mao's wrath had long silenced dissent, senior leaders began to realize that continuing down this path meant the complete destruction of the Chinese state and the potential collapse of communist rule itself. For the first time since he had seized absolute authority, Mao found his supreme wisdom questioned, his policies quietly rolled back, and his personal influence sliding into a temporary but bitter decline. The shift began behind closed doors as pragmatic leaders within the party, most notably Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, took charge of day-to-day economic management to pull the country back from the brink of total collapse. Liu Shaoqi, who had toured his home province of Hunan and witnessed the horrifying reality of the famine firsthand, returned to Beijing deeply shaken. He famously declared that the disaster was 3 parts natural and 7 parts man-made, a direct and devastating critique of Mao's utopian policies. Without directly attacking Mao's personal prestige, these pragmatic leaders initiated emergency measures to rescue the dying population. They disbanded the disastrous backyard steel furnaces, allowed peasants to leave the communal dining halls, and quietly permitted families to farm small private plots once again and raise their own pigs and chickens. The emergency grain imports from abroad, particularly from Canada and Australia, were rushed into the starving cities and provinces to keep people alive. Mao, who had retreated to a degree from active daily administration, watched these developments with a growing sense of unease and paranoia. He recognized that the retreat from his beloved communes and mass campaigns was a direct repudiation of his political vision. In early 1962, at the momentous 7,000 Cadres conference held in Beijing, the tensions boiled over into the open. The conference was convened to review the mistakes of the past few years and rally the party. While Liu Shaoqi delivered a generally frank assessment of the economic disaster and acknowledged that the party had made severe errors, Mao was forced to offer a formal self-criticism, accepting nominal responsibility as the chairman of the party. However, Mao's acceptance of blame was deeply calculated and laced with defensive defiance. Deep down, he did not believe he had been wrong. He believed that the failures were caused by poor local implementation, uncooperative officials, and class enemies who lacked true revolutionary zeal. During this period of introspection and policy reversal, Marshal Peng Dehuai, the Minister of Defense who had famously tried to warn Mao about the famine during the Lushan Conference in 1959, cast a long shadow over the internal party struggles. Although Peng had been brutally purged, stripped of his military posts, and banished from power after his courageous critique, his warnings had been vindicated by the horrifying reality of the ensuing years. Mao never forgave Peng Dehuai for challenging his authority, and the memory of that confrontation fueled Mao's deep-seated suspicion that his comrades were plotting against him behind his back. He became increasingly convinced that revisionism, the abandonment of true revolutionary Marxism in favor of capitalist economic methods, was creeping into the highest ranks of the Chinese Communist Party. He saw the pragmatic reforms of Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping not as life-saving measures, but as a betrayal of the revolution and a step down the path that the Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev was taking. As the economy slowly began to recover between 1962 and 1965, thanks to the relaxation of radical ideological controls and the return of basic market incentives in the countryside, Mao's frustration reached a boiling point. He watched from the sidelines as Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping restored agricultural production and stabilized industrial output, earning immense popularity and respect among ordinary party members and citizens who were grateful for the return of food and relative peace. But Mao viewed this recovery with profound alarm. To him, stability was a dangerous illusion that bred bourgeois complacency and stripped the party of its militant spirit. He believed that a revolution must be a continuous, violent struggle, and that a peaceful society would inevitably degenerate into capitalism. He famously warned the party to never forget class struggle, signaling that he was merely biding his time before launching a counteroffensive to reclaim absolute ideological dominance. Behind the scenes, Mao began laying the meticulous groundwork for his return to total power. He recognized that he could no longer rely on the established party bureaucracy, which was largely loyal to Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, and the pragmatic administrators. Instead, he cultivated new alliances with radical ideologues who shared his worldview and pandered to his revolutionary romanticism. Among these key allies were his ambitious and power-hungry wife, Jiang Qing, who sought to control the cultural and artistic spheres, Chen Boda, a radical party theoretician, and Kang Sheng, the ruthless chief of security and intelligence. Furthermore, Mao forged a crucial partnership with Lin Biao, the head of the People's Liberation Army. Lin Biao had transformed the military into a bastion of extreme personal loyalty to Mao, publishing the famous Little Red Book of Mao's quotations, and demanding that soldiers study Mao's thought as a supreme guide to life and warfare. Mao used the cultural, educational, and literary arenas as the initial battleground for his planned political comeback. Through his wife Jiang Qing and radical literary critics, he launched veiled and then open attacks on plays, historical novels, and films that were perceived as critical of his leadership or insufficiently revolutionary. One prominent target was a historical play titled The Dismissal of Hai Rui from Office, written by the historian and Beijing deputy mayor Wu Han. The play told the story of an honest official in the Ming dynasty who was unjustly fired by a corrupt emperor for defending the peasants. Mao and his radical allies correctly interpreted the play as an allegorical defense of Peng Dehuai and a thinly veiled critique of Mao's dismissal of Peng during the famine. The attack on the play, orchestrated by radical intellectuals in Shanghai with Mao's secret backing, served as a lightning rod that polarized the political establishment in Beijing. For months, the moderate leadership in Beijing, led by Liu Shaoqi and Beijing Mayor Peng Zhen, tried to contain these ideological disputes, treating them as academic discussions rather than political threats. They attempted to deflect Mao's attacks by issuing mild self-criticisms of cultural works, while trying to protect intellectuals and party officials from purge. But Mao viewed these moderate efforts as obstructionist tactics designed to shield anti-party elements. By late 1965, Mao felt strong enough to break out of his political isolation. He left Beijing for the security of Shanghai and the southern provinces, where he could plan his next moves free from the surveillance of his moderate rivals within the party apparatus. In exile from the capital's daily administrative routines, Mao sharpened his weapons. He surrounded himself with loyal radicals who helped him draft inflammatory political documents and directives that condemned the party leadership for sliding down the capitalist road. He accused Beijing of becoming an independent kingdom that ignored his instructions, complaining that he had been treated like a dead ancestor whose portrait was hung on the wall for show, but whose voice was no longer heeded. He prepared to mobilize an entirely new political force, one that bypassed the corrupted party bureaucracy and relied directly on the raw, impressionable energy of China's youth. He was determined to smash the party machine that had sidelined him and purge every leader who had dared to doubt his vision during the dark years of the famine. This period of plotting marked a sinister turning point in modern Chinese history. Mao was not interested in peaceful coexistence or democratic consensus. He was driven by a messianic conviction that only through violent upheaval and the total destruction of his political rivals could the purity of the revolution be saved. While ordinary citizens were still recovering from the physical and psychological scars of the Great Leap Forward, unaware of the gathering storm, the aging chairman was forging the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. He was planning a political earthquake that would dwarf all previous campaigns, tearing apart families, schools, factories, and the entire fabric of Chinese society in a desperate, ruthless bid to reclaim his throne and cement his legacy for all eternity. By the spring of 1966, the political atmosphere in Beijing had become thick with tension, suspicion, and a strange, heavy silence as the ruling elite awaited Mao Zedong's next move. For months, radical ideologues sheltered in Shanghai under Mao's direct protection had been sharpening their ideological weapons, attacking moderate party officials, intellectuals, and cultural figures who were accused of harboring bourgeois or revisionist sympathies. The moderate leaders in Beijing, headed by head of state Liu Shaoqi and party general secretary Deng Xiaoping, still hoped to contain the brewing storm through standard bureaucratic channels and controlled ideological discussions. They believed that by offering minor concessions and issuing moderate directives, they could appease the aging chairman and prevent a full-scale political rupture. But they fundamentally misunderstood the depth of Mao's wrath and the radical nature of his ambitions. Mao was not interested in superficial compromises or academic debates. He was determined to shatter the entire party apparatus that had sidelined him after the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward. In May 1966, a crucial meeting of the Politburo Standing Committee in Beijing formally revoked the moderate guidelines proposed by Peng Zhen and the Beijing Municipal Committee, purging Peng Zhen and several other prominent moderate leaders. This decisive blow signaled to the entire nation that the protective shield of the municipal party apparatus had been broken, opening the floodgates for an unprecedented upheaval that would soon consume the country. The formal launch of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution was marked by the adoption of the infamous May 16 notification, a radical document drafted under Mao's direct guidance that denounced those within the party who were taking the capitalist road, and warned that representatives of the bourgeoisie had wormed their way into the party, the government, and the army. To bypass the established party hierarchy, which remained largely loyal to Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, Mao turned his revolutionary gaze toward China's schools and universities, where impressionable young students were primed for radical mobilization. The first public spark ignited at Peking University, where a philosophy lecturer named Nai Yuanzi posted a daring wall poster, or dazibao, attacking the university administration as counter-revolutionary revisionists. With Mao's secret backing, the text of Nai Yuanzi's poster was broadcast nationally over state radio and published on the front page of the People's Daily, transforming a localized campus dispute into a nationwide clarion call. Across China, students in high schools and universities suddenly felt empowered to rise up against their teachers, principals, and school administrators, whom they accused of suppressing revolutionary enthusiasm. Classes were suspended indefinitely, examinations were canceled, and campuses dissolved into chaotic arenas of ideological debate, accusation, and fierce factional infighting. Out of this volatile campus environment emerged the Red Guards, fanatical groups of militant students who wrapped themselves in Maoist ideology and declared themselves the vanguard of the Cultural Revolution, wearing armbands adorned with red stars and carrying copies of the newly ubiquitous Little Red Book containing Mao's quotations. These young zealots viewed themselves as holy warriors fighting a life-or-death battle against class enemies and hidden traitors. Mao openly encouraged their radical fervor, writing a personal letter to a group of Red Guards at Tsinghua University Experimental Middle School, praising their rebellious spirit and declaring that to rebel is justified. For millions of teenagers who had grown up under the strict discipline of the party state and the shadow of their parents' traditional authority, the Cultural Revolution offered an intoxicating release of pent-up energy, moral certainty, and absolute power. They were told that they were carrying out a sacred mission to purify Chinese society, purge bourgeois elements, and defend Chairman Mao against those who sought to restore capitalism. Armed with this ideological sanction, the Red Guards turned their youthful rage against anyone perceived as an obstacle to the revolutionary purity of the state, plunging schools, neighborhoods, and cities into a terrifying spiral of lawlessness and violence. The initial wave of Red Guard terror struck directly at the heart of China's educational and cultural establishment, as teachers, professors, school principals, and intellectuals were dragged before screaming mobs of their own students for humiliating public struggle sessions. Victims were forced to wear tall, conical paper hats bearing insulting inscriptions, hang heavy wooden boards around their necks detailing their alleged crimes, and bow their heads in painful, contorted physical postures known as the airplane position while being spat upon, beaten, and berated for hours on end. Many prominent scholars, writers, and artists, unable to endure the relentless physical torture, psychological degradation, and public humiliation, chose to end their own lives. University campuses, once sanctuaries of learning and academic discourse, were transformed into detention centers and ideological battlegrounds where ancient traditions and Western learning were denounced as poison. The Red Guards smashed laboratory equipment, tore down library books, and vandalized classrooms, convinced that formal education was a bourgeois luxury that bred intellectual elitism and alienated the youth from the working masses. As the summer of 1966 progressed, the violence of the Red Guards rapidly expanded beyond the ivy-covered walls of universities and high schools to target the wider society in a sweeping frenzy known as the destruction of the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Traveling in massive, freewheeling groups across the country on the state railway system, Red Guards rampaged through cities and villages, smashing street signs, renaming thoroughfares with revolutionary monikers, and breaking into private homes to confiscate foreign books, traditional paintings, musical instruments, and stylish clothing. Temples, churches, ancient shrines, and historical monuments that had survived for centuries were systematically ransacked, looted, and reduced to rubble by zealous youths who believed they were building a bright socialist paradise upon the ashes of the feudal past. Citizens found walking on the streets with Western-style shoes, narrow trousers, or braided hair were routinely harassed, humiliated, and assaulted on the spot, their clothes slashed with scissors by militant teens enforcing arbitrary standards of revolutionary austerity. Even ordinary family heirlooms, ancestral tablets, and wedding photographs were seized and burned in massive bonfires on public streets, severing the deep historical and familial links that tied the Chinese people to their heritage. The chaos soon reached the highest levels of the central government and the party apparatus, as Mao turned the wrath of the Red Guards against the very officials who had attempted to moderate his policies during the famine years. In August 1966, Mao returned to Beijing to convene the 11th plenum of the Central Committee, a pivotal meeting where he openly threw his weight behind the radical student movement and signaled that the entire party leadership was under suspicion. To demonstrate his personal alignment with the youthful rebels, Mao wrote his own dazibao entitled "Bombard the Headquarters," launching a thinly veiled attack on Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, and accusing them of enforcing a bourgeois dictatorship during the darkest days of the country's recovery. Liu Shaoqi, who had served as the head of state and Mao's designated successor, found himself stripped of his real power, isolated within his own compound, and subjected to vicious wall poster campaigns organized by radical students and party rivals. Deng Xiaoping was similarly branded the second biggest person in authority taking the capitalist road, and was removed from all meaningful administrative posts, setting the stage for their eventual imprisonment, persecution, and physical ruin. Amidst this escalating political earthquake, Mao orchestrated a massive public display of support by reviewing millions of Red Guards who had converged on Beijing from every corner of the country. Standing atop the monumental rostrum of Tiananmen Square, Mao looked down upon a vast, undulating sea of red flags, waving copies of the Little Red Book, and roaring revolutionary slogans shouted by over 1 million ecstatic youths. For these young radicals, catching a glimpse of the great helmsman was a profoundly religious experience. Many wept openly, fainting from emotional exhaustion and devotion as Mao smiled and waved from above. Between August and November 1966, 8 massive rallies were held in Tiananmen Square, accommodating more than 11 million Red Guards who were provided with free food, lodging, and railway transportation courtesy of the state and the People's Liberation Army. These rallies served as a powerful logistical and psychological engine, empowering the youth to return to their home provinces with a renewed sense of divine mission, and spreading the fires of the Cultural Revolution to factories, mines, rural communes, and government offices across the entire mainland. As the Red Guards fanned out across China to stir up revolution everywhere, the movement fractured into competing factions, each claiming to be the true and authentic interpreters of Mao Zedong thought. Different groups of students, workers, and peasants formed rival organizations that vied for power, prestige, and control over local government committees, leading to bitter turf wars and escalating street battles. By the winter of 1966 and early 1967, the ideological disputes degenerated into bloody armed conflicts, fought with stolen military weapons, artillery, and armored vehicles supplied by sympathetic factions within the local militia and the military. Cities like Wuhan, Guangzhou, and Shanghai became war zones where factory workers organized into conservative self-defense militias, clashed violently with radical student Red Guards, paralyzing industrial production, halting transportation networks, and bringing the national economy to a grinding halt. The established legal system, police force, and municipal governments had completely collapsed, leaving ordinary citizens at the mercy of rival gangs of armed zealots who dispensed arbitrary justice in the name of the chairman. The economic paralysis and widespread social anarchy forced Mao and his military allies to intervene in January 1967 to restore a semblance of order through a policy known as the seizure of power, or the January Storm, which began in Shanghai. Radical worker organizations, backed by Mao's radical allies in the Central Cultural Revolution Group, overthrew the Municipal Party Committee and established a new provisional governing body called the Shanghai People's Commune, later renamed the Revolutionary Committee. This model of revolutionary governance, a tripartite alliance combining representatives of the revolutionary mass organizations, the People's Liberation Army, and repentant revolutionary cadres, was soon replicated across every province, city, and autonomous region in China. However, rather than restoring peace, the creation of revolutionary committees often institutionalized factional warfare, as rival groups fought viciously for dominant representation within the new administrative bodies. The military, led by Defense Minister Lin Biao, was increasingly deployed to restore order, arbitrate local disputes, and run factories and farms, quietly elevating the political and institutional influence of the People's Liberation Army to unprecedented heights. Throughout this dark and tumultuous period, the human cost of the Cultural Revolution mounted into staggering and unimaginable proportions. Millions of innocent people, party veterans, intellectuals, artists, teachers, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens who had uttered a careless word or held a perceived incorrect thought, were arrested, interrogated, tortured, and sent to remote labor camps for re-education through hard physical labor. Families were torn apart as children were encouraged by party ideologues to denounce their parents as counter-revolutionaries, and husbands and wives turned against each other out of fear of guilt by association. Historic temples, irreplaceable works of art, ancient libraries, and priceless artifacts were pulverized into dust, erasing centuries of Chinese cultural heritage in a frantic attempt to create a blank slate for Mao's utopian vision. The economy suffered billions of dollars in losses, agricultural and industrial production plummeted, and an entire generation of young people was denied formal education, as schools and universities remained shuttered for years. Mao had succeeded in smashing the party apparatus that had defied him, but the victory was won over a bleeding, fractured nation whose social fabric, cultural soul, and human conscience had been severely and perhaps irreparably mutilated. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the violent convulsions of the Cultural Revolution had left China politically isolated on the world stage, its foreign policy paralyzed by ideological dogmatism and domestic radicalism. While Chinese embassies across the globe echoed with revolutionary slogans and Red Guards engaged in diplomatic skirmishes, Chairman Mao Zedong and Premier Xu Enlai faced a rapidly shifting international landscape that posed profound strategic threats to the People's Republic. For over 2 decades, Beijing's primary security alignment had been anchored in its alliance with the Soviet Union, forged in the wake of the 1949 communist victory. However, the ideological and geopolitical fractures that had been quietly brewing throughout the late 1950s had exploded into open hostility during the subsequent decade, transforming Moscow from a fraternal socialist brother into China's most dangerous and immediate military adversary. The Sino-Soviet split was rooted in deep-seated disagreements over Marxist-Leninist doctrine, national sovereignty, and leadership of the international communist movement. Following the death of Joseph Stalin, Mao deeply resented the new Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev, viewing their policies of de-Stalinization and peaceful coexistence with the capitalist West as a betrayal of true revolutionary principles. Khrushchev, in turn, looked upon Mao as an unpredictable and reckless dogmatist who was willing to risk nuclear annihilation in pursuit of global revolution. These mounting tensions were exacerbated by territorial disputes along the vast, contested border in Central Asia and the Far East, where Soviet and Chinese troops faced each other in a state of perpetual readiness. The situation deteriorated to an alarming degree in 1969, when bloody military clashes broke out over disputed islands on the Ushiri River along the Manchurian border, most notably at Zhenbao Island, and later along the Xinjiang frontier. As hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops massed along China's northern border, backed by nuclear threats and aggressive war games, Beijing's leadership realized with terrifying clarity that the Soviet Union posed an existential threat that far outweighed any perceived dangers from Western imperialism. The traditional communist doctrine of proletarian internationalism had shattered beyond repair, forcing Mao and his inner circle to contemplate a radical and unprecedented geopolitical realignment. The man who had spent his entire political life denouncing American imperialism as the arch-enemy of global revolution, now found himself compelled to seek a diplomatic opening to the United States to counter the overwhelming shadow of Soviet military might. This monumental strategic pivot required extraordinary political maneuvering, as it meant bridging decades of bitter enmity, the lingering trauma of the Korean War, and the fiery anti-American rhetoric that still dominated domestic propaganda during the height of the Cultural Revolution. Premier Zhou Enlai, whose administrative acumen and diplomatic pragmatism had survived the worst storms of the domestic purges, became the primary architect of this historic opening. Zhou recognized that China could not afford to face the Soviet Union alone, while the country's economy and social structure were still reeling from the chaos of the Red Guard years. Cautious signals and secret diplomatic channels were established through intermediary nations like Pakistan and Romania, laying the groundwork for a dialogue that would shock the international community and redraw the contours of Cold War geopolitics. The first breakthrough came in the spring of 1971 during the World Table Tennis Championships in Nagoya, Japan, where the American player Glenn Cowan accidentally boarded the Chinese team bus. In a gesture orchestrated by Mao himself, the Chinese player Mao Zedong presented Cowan with a silk cloth gift, leading to an official invitation for the U.S. table tennis team to visit China. This unlikely event, which became globally famous as ping-pong diplomacy, captured the world's imagination and opened the door for high-level political engagement. In July 1971, U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger undertook a secret, clandestine mission to Beijing, slipping away from his official itinerary in Pakistan and flying into the Chinese capital under the cover of diplomatic secrecy. Over the course of intense, late-night discussions at the Diaoyutai State Guest House, Kissinger and Zhou Enlai mapped out the framework for a grand strategic understanding, discussing mutual concerns regarding Soviet hegemony, the status of Taiwan, and the withdrawal of American forces from Indochina. Kissinger's secret visit paved the way for an event that would have seemed utterly impossible just a few years prior: the historic visit of U.S. President Richard Nixon to China in February 1972. When Air Force One touched down at Beijing Capital International Airport, President Nixon stepped out and walked down the ramp with his hand extended, offering a formal handshake to Premier Zhou Enlai, a deliberate correction of a famous diplomatic slight from 1954, when then-Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had refused to shake Zhou's hand in Geneva. During his week-long visit, President Nixon was granted a private audience with Chairman Mao Zedong at his private residence in Zhongnanhai. In a wide-ranging and often philosophical conversation, Mao, frail and struggling with declining health, but possessing a sharp and pragmatic mind, discussed geopolitics with the American president, signaling his willingness to put ideological differences aside in the face of shared strategic necessities. The culmination of Nixon's visit was the signing of the Shanghai Communiqué, a joint statement in which both nations acknowledged their fundamental disagreements on various issues, while outlining areas of potential cooperation and agreeing to work toward the normalization of diplomatic relations. For Taiwan, the communiqué represented a major turning point, as the United States acknowledged that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China, while Beijing reiterated its firm stance that the Taiwan question is the crucial question obstructing the normalization of relations. The opening to the United States sent shockwaves through the global communist movement, alienating traditional allies like North Vietnam and North Korea, while transforming the triangular dynamics of the Cold War. Moscow watched the Beijing-Washington rapprochement with deep anxiety, realizing that its strategic encirclement of China had backfired and created a formidable de facto alliance against Soviet expansionism. Domestically, The diplomatic pivot presented a profound ideological paradox for the Chinese populace, who had spent decades being fed a steady diet of intense anti-American propaganda. Overnight, state media shifted its tone, reframing the United States not as an imminent imperialist invader, but as a pragmatic partner in checking Soviet social imperialism. Citizens across China were instructed to study new foreign policy directives and welcome foreign dignitaries, even as ideological hardliners within the party, most notably Mao's wife Jiang Qing and her radical allies, struggled to reconcile the diplomatic opening with their revolutionary rhetoric. Despite the lingering domestic turbulence, the historic rapprochement with the United States successfully shattered China's international isolation, secured its borders against the immediate threat of Soviet military invasion, and paved the way for Beijing's eventual return to the United Nations, where the People's Republic assumed China's seat on the Security Council in late 1971. Mao's supreme pragmatism in foreign affairs demonstrated that his commitment to Chinese state sovereignty and national security ultimately transcended the rigid ideological dogmas that governed his domestic policies. Yet, even as China began to engage with the wider capitalist world and welcome foreign diplomats, businessmen, and journalists to its shores, the country remained deeply scarred by the ideological fanaticism of the ongoing Cultural Revolution. The stark contrast between the smiling faces of American presidents shaking hands with Chinese leaders in Beijing and the brutal political purges, labor camps, and factional violence unfolding in the provinces highlighted the profound contradictions of Mao's final decade in power. China had stepped out onto the global stage, but the soul of the revolution remained violently fractured, trapped in the twilight of an aging chairman's unyielding and absolute authority. By the mid-1970s, the physical body of Chairman Mao Zedong was failing rapidly, but his grip on the political destiny of China remained as absolute and unyielding as ever. The man who had driven a nation through decades of revolution, civil war, and cataclysmic social upheaval was now an aged, frail patriarch struggling with severe respiratory and cardiovascular ailments, including advanced pulmonary disease and debilitating motor neuron complications. Yet, even as his health deteriorated to the point where he could barely walk, speak clearly, or review official documents without assistance, Mao remained the undisputed center of gravity in Beijing. Surrounding his heavily guarded compound in Zhongnanhai was a labyrinth of intense political intrigue, where ambitious factions vied fiercely for position in anticipation of the inevitable succession. The twilight of Mao's reign was characterized by a bitter, high-stakes power struggle between two sharply contrasting political forces within the Chinese Communist Party: the radical ideologues who had risen to power during the Cultural Revolution, and the veteran pragmatists who sought to restore institutional order, economic stability, and administrative competence. At the forefront of the radical faction was the formidable Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, alongside her close political allies Zhang Chengqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen, a group that would later be infamously branded by history as the Gang of Four. These radical leaders had entrenched themselves deep within the cultural, propaganda, and security apparatuses of the party, using their proximity to Mao and their control over mass media to shield themselves from criticism, while systematically targeting their political opponents. Their primary objective was to ensure that the radical ideological purity of the Cultural Revolution survived Mao's passing. They viewed any attempt to restore economic pragmatism, professional expertise, or traditional governance as a treacherous slide back toward capitalism and revisionism. To maintain their revolutionary momentum, Jiang Qing and her allies continually manufactured political campaigns, directing the passionate energy of radical youth and party militias against anyone deemed insufficiently revolutionary. Opposing this radical vanguard was a resilient cadre of veteran statesmen, military commanders, and economic administrators who had survived the purges of the previous decade through a combination of political caution, resilience, and indispensable utility to the state. The most prominent leader of this pragmatic camp was Premier Zhou Enlai, who, despite battling terminal cancer throughout his final years, worked tirelessly behind the scenes to shield key administrators, stabilize the shattered national economy, and repair China's damaged international relationships. Zhou recognized that the endless cycle of political purges and ideological warfare was pushing the country toward total institutional collapse. However, Zhou's own health was failing rapidly, and he knew he needed a dynamic, capable successor who shared his vision for national recovery. That mantle fell upon Deng Xiaoping, a veteran revolutionary and former general secretary of the party whom Mao had previously purged during the early years of the Cultural Revolution, but had subsequently rehabilitated in 1973 to help restore administrative order. With Mao's tacit approval, Deng Xiaoping was brought back into the upper echelons of power, assuming the roles of vice premier, vice chairman of the military commission, and chief of the general staff. Possessing a notoriously sharp intellect, immense political courage, and a pragmatic, no-nonsense approach to governance, Deng lost no time in tackling the chaos that plagued the country. With the backing of Zhou Enlai, Deng launched a comprehensive program of administrative and economic readjustment, often referred to as the Four Modernizations. Though the term was first coined earlier, Deng gave it practical substance. He began restoring professional standards in industry, emphasizing scientific research, revitalizing the educational system by reinstating rigorous academic examinations, and reasserting discipline in the factories and railways. Deng believed that China could not remain a stagnant ideological battleground, while the rest of the modern world advanced technologically and economically. His policies struck a chord with millions of weary citizens, factory workers, and intellectuals who had suffered through years of political persecution and economic stagnation. This rapid ascent of pragmatic leadership, however, directly threatened the ideological monopoly of the Gang of Four. A fierce, protracted tug-of-war ensued inside the highest corridors of power, with both factions constantly seeking Mao's ultimate arbitration. Mao's attitude toward these internal conflicts was characteristically complex, contradictory, and deeply manipulative. While he recognized the need for administrative competence and supported Deng Xiaoping's efforts to get the economy moving again, Mao remained fundamentally terrified that his life's work, the permanent revolution against bureaucratic complacency and capitalist restoration, would be undone after his death. He viewed the Cultural Revolution as his greatest historical achievement and his ultimate legacy. Whenever Deng's economic and educational reforms leaned too far toward conventional governance or threatened to discredit the radical upheaval of the previous decade, Mao pulled back, expressing profound suspicion that Deng and his allies were closet revisionists determined to reverse the verdicts of the Cultural Revolution. The tension between the two factions reached a fever pitch in late 1975 and early 1976. The immediate catalyst for tragedy occurred on January 8, 1976, when Premier Zhou Enlai finally succumbed to bladder cancer. Zhou had been the beloved, stabilizing anchor of the Chinese government for over 2 decades, a soothing diplomatic face to the outside world, and a protective shield for countless citizens during the darkest days of the Red Guard terror. His death triggered an overwhelming wave of national grief and public mourning that caught the ruling leadership entirely off guard. Across China, millions of ordinary people wept openly in the streets, mourning not just a statesman, but the embodiment of reason, moderation, and survival through the storms of the era. In Beijing, ordinary citizens began streaming into Tiananmen Square, gathering spontaneously around the monument to the people's heroes to lay wreaths, poems, and memorial banners dedicated to the late premier. These tributes quickly assumed a distinctly political character. Beneath the glowing praise for Zhu Enlai lay thinly veiled, sharp criticisms of the Gang of Four and the radical policies they championed. Fearing that the public mourning would spiral out of control and challenge their political legitimacy, the radical faction panicked. Under pressure from Jiang Qing and her associates, the Beijing municipal government and the party leadership declared the public gatherings illegal, ordering the square to be cleared and removing all wreaths and memorials under the cover of night. This heavy-handed suppression ignited a massive public explosion of anger. On the morning of April 4, 1976, during the traditional Qingming Festival, a day dedicated to honoring the dead, hundreds of thousands of furious citizens reoccupied Tiananmen Square. What began as a peaceful demonstration of mourning transformed into an open uprising against the radical authorities. Protesters chanted slogans demanding reform, clashed with security forces, overturned police cars, and set fire to official buildings and guard posts around the square. For hours, the center of Beijing was entirely in the hands of angry crowds. By evening, the security apparatus mobilized heavily, deploying tens of thousands of workers, militias, police officers, and security troops to brutally clear the square. Unarmed protesters, students, and workers were beaten, arrested, and hauled away in a violent crackdown that left an uncalculated number of casualties. The Tiananmen incident, as it came to be known, sent shockwaves through the party leadership. Rather than recognizing the deep-seated public yearning for normalcy and reform, Mao and his inner circle viewed the uprising as a counter-revolutionary riot. Blaming Deng Xiaoping for orchestrating the protests from behind the scenes, pointing to his recent pragmatic policies as the psychological fuel for the unrest, Mao authorized his immediate dismissal from all party and government posts. It was Deng's second dramatic fall from grace, and it left the pragmatic faction momentarily shattered and leaderless. Yet, even as the radicals celebrated their apparent victory and launched a nationwide media campaign to denounce Deng Xiaoping, the physical foundation of the regime was crumbling beneath them. Mao Zedong's health entered its final, irreversible decline through the scorching summer of 1976. Adding to the psychological trauma of the nation, nature itself seemed to reflect the chaotic agony of the political landscape. On July 28, 1976, one of the deadliest earthquakes in recorded human history struck the industrial city of Tangshan, located just over 100 miles east of Beijing. Registering an estimated magnitude of 7.5 to 8.2, the cataclysm struck in the dead of night while millions were sleeping, flattening entire neighborhoods, trapping families beneath mountains of rubble, and instantly killing hundreds of thousands of people. The infrastructure of Tangshan was virtually obliterated, and the tremors were felt strongly inside Mao's residential compound in Beijing. For a population steeped in traditional cultural beliefs, the catastrophic Tangshan earthquake was interpreted as a terrifying prophetic omen, a celestial sign that the mandate of heaven was withdrawing from the aging ruler. Superstition and political anxiety merged as grieving survivors in northern China lived out in the open makeshift tents for months, fearing further tremors and mourning both their lost families and a collapsing world. Mao, lying frail and barely conscious in his bed, was informed of the horrific disaster. Reportedly, tears welled in his eyes as he listened to reports of the immense human suffering, recognizing that his final months were playing out against a backdrop of apocalyptic national tragedy. Just weeks later, on September 9, 1976, the inevitable news that had hung over China like a dark cloud for years was finally broadcast to the world. Chairman Mao Zedong passed away at the age of 82. The announcement, delivered by state radio with solemn, weeping announcers, plunged the nation into a profound state of emotional paralysis and deep uncertainty. For hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens who had grown up knowing no other leader, Mao was not merely a political figure. He was the semi-divine architect of modern China, the man who had stood atop the gate of heavenly peace in 1949 to declare that the Chinese people had stood up. Across the country, factories fell silent, trains stopped on their tracks, and millions of citizens gathered in public squares to weep hysterically, wearing black armbands and white paper flowers of mourning. Over the following week, 1 million mourners filed past Mao's body as it lay in state inside the Great Hall of the People, many collapsing in grief, genuinely terrified of what the future held now that the towering patriarch was gone. Yet, beneath the massive public displays of national grief, the immediate emotional vacuum was instantly overshadowed by the chilling realization that a ruthless succession struggle was about to erupt. With Mao gone, the fragile truce that had held the opposing factions together evaporated instantly. The Gang of Four believed that their moment of absolute triumph had arrived, preparing to seize total control of the party apparatus and purge their remaining rivals once and for all. However, they drastically underestimated the quiet determination of the military leadership and surviving veteran pragmatists, who knew that another round of radical extremist rule would destroy the country entirely. The stage was set for a swift, covert, and decisive counter-coup that would sweep away the architects of the Cultural Revolution and push China onto a completely new historical trajectory. The death of Chairman Mao Zedong on September 9, 1976, left a massive political vacuum at the very heart of the Chinese state. For decades, Mao had stood as the ultimate arbiter of all internal disputes, balancing factions against one another while maintaining absolute personal authority. Now, with the patriarch gone, the fragile equilibrium that had kept the regime from tearing itself apart completely evaporated. China stood at a profound historical crossroads. On one side stood the radical ideologues of the Gang of Four, who controlled the party's propaganda machine, security networks, and militia organizations, and who were fully prepared to seize total state power and push the ongoing class struggles to even greater extremes. On the other side stood the traumatized populace, the veteran military commanders, and the battered network of pragmatic administrators who had suffered through years of purges, political chaos, and economic stagnation, and who desperately yearned for stability, normalcy, and a rational path forward. Within hours of Mao's passing, the capital city of Beijing became a tense labyrinth of secret meetings, whispered conspiracies, and high-stakes maneuvering. The Gang of Four, comprising Jiang Qing, Zhang Chengqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen, acted with supreme arrogance, assuming that the party apparatus would naturally fall into their hands just as Mao's health had failed. They believed they had effectively sidelined their primary opposition with the second purge of Deng Xiaoping earlier that year, and they expected to inherit the mantle of the Cultural Revolution without serious resistance. However, they gravely miscalculated the depth of hostility directed toward them by the military leadership and veteran revolutionaries, who had spent the twilight of Mao's reign watching the country push toward the brink of total institutional collapse. At the center of the counter-conspiracy, to block the radicals, stood two key figures: Marshal Yi Jianying, the veteran military leader who commanded immense respect and loyalty within the People's Liberation Army, and Hua Guofeng, whom Mao had handpicked as his immediate successor as premier and chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. While Hua Guofeng had risen through the ranks during the height of the Maoist era and initially professed loyalty to continuing Mao's revolutionary line, he recognized that any attempt by Jiang Qing and her radical faction to seize supreme power would lead to a catastrophic civil war or the complete destruction of the party. Urged on by veteran marshals and pragmatic party elders who feared a bloody radical takeover, Hua Guofeng quietly forged a decisive alliance with Marshal Yi Jianying and Wang Dongxing, the commander of the elite Central Security Bureau, who controlled Mao's personal bodyguards and the security of the leadership compound in Zhongnanhai. The strike against the radicals was planned with meticulous precision and executed with breathtaking speed just weeks after Mao's death, on the evening of October 6, 1976. Operating under the guise of an emergency political meeting at the State Guest House, Wang Dongxing's elite security units moved in swiftly, arresting Zhang Chengqiao, Wang Hongwen, and Yao Wenyuan one by one as they arrived, without firing a single shot. Simultaneously, another security team moved on Jiang Qing's residence and placed Mao's widow under immediate house arrest. Within less than an hour, the entire leadership of the radical faction had been neutralized without warning, catching the party and the nation completely off guard. The news of the arrest of the Gang of Four spread through the upper echelons of the party first as an unbelievable shock, quickly followed by an overwhelming wave of private relief and quiet celebration among the veteran cadres. When the official announcement was finally broadcast to the public reaction across China was electric. Far from mourning the downfall of the radical leaders, millions of ordinary citizens flooded the streets spontaneously, beating gongs, letting off firecrackers, waving banners, and dancing in public squares. State-run newspapers quickly pivoted, denouncing the Gang of Four as counter-revolutionary careerists and anti-party conspirators who had hijacked the ideals of the revolution for their own selfish ambitions. For a populace that had endured a decade of terror, humiliation, and institutional destruction during the Cultural Revolution, the removal of the radicals felt like the lifting of a dark, suffocating cloud. With the radical faction safely locked away, Hua Guofeng initially consolidated his position by assuming the top party and military posts, attempting to project himself as the legitimate ideological heir to Mao Zedong. He famously coined the formula known as the two whatevers. We will resolutely uphold whatever policy decisions Chairman Mao made, and we will unswervingly follow whatever instructions Chairman Mao gave. Hua believed this conservative stance was necessary to preserve political continuity and legitimize his own leadership in the immediate aftermath of the Founding Fathers' death. However, this rigid adherence to Mao's past directives quickly proved unsustainable. Millions of wrongfully persecuted cadres, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens who had been purged or imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution began flooding Beijing with petitions demanding formal rehabilitation, the overturning of past political verdicts, and a return to legal order. Pressure mounted rapidly from veteran revolutionaries and military commanders who had survived the purges, chief among them being Deng Xiaoping, who was still living quietly in political obscurity outside Beijing. Deng, possessing a strategic political vision and a deep understanding of China's structural exhaustion, bided his time while working quietly behind the scenes to gather support among regional military leaders and pragmatic administrators. He understood that simply preserving the old dogmatic formulas would leave China trapped in permanent economic backwardness, while the rest of the world forged ahead. Deng argued astutely that practice was the sole criterion of truth, subtly challenging the dogmatic worship of Mao's every word, and laying the vital ideological groundwork for fundamental reform. By the late 1970s, the political tide had turned irreversibly in favor of the pragmatic camp. Hua Guofeng's authority steadily eroded as the party establishment recognized that true national recovery required a clean break from the destructive leftist policies of the past. At the historic third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party in December 1978, a watershed moment in modern Chinese history, Deng Xiaoping officially emerged as the core of the new leadership collective. The plenum formally repudiated the chaotic political campaigns of the Cultural Revolution, rehabilitated hundreds of thousands of victims of political purges, and decisively shifted the party's primary focus away from endless ideological class struggle and toward economic modernization, agricultural productivity, and national development. Under Deng Xiaoping's visionary yet hard-nosed leadership, China embarked on a stunning economic transformation that diverged sharply from Maoist orthodoxy. Recognizing the crippling inefficiencies of the strict command economy, Deng introduced sweeping rural reforms that dismantled the rigid people's communes, restored household farming, and allowed peasants to sell their surplus produce on open markets. He championed the creation of special economic zones along China's southern coast, welcoming foreign investment, embracing international trade, and encouraging private entrepreneurship. The famous pragmatic maxim attributed to Deng, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice," became the guiding philosophy for a new era of rapid industrialization and pragmatic experimentation. Yet, even as China aggressively dismantled the economic and organizational structures of the Maoist era, the party leadership faced a delicate and complex political dilemma regarding Mao Zedong's historical reputation. Unlike Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, whose legacy was subjected to total denunciation by Nikita Khrushchev, Mao could not be completely repudiated without destroying the very ideological legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party itself. Mao remained the founding father of the People's Republic, the architect of national sovereignty, and the symbolic unifier of a fractured country. The party ultimately resolved this historical paradox through a carefully crafted official verdict. Mao was credited with immense historic achievements in founding the nation, but was gently criticized for committing severe errors during his later years, particularly through the catastrophic miscalculations of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Through this formula, the post-Mao leadership successfully distanced itself from the destructive radicalism of the past, while preserving the foundational myth of party supremacy. The physical body of Mao Zedong, preserved in a massive granite mausoleum built directly in the center of Tiananmen Square, remained on permanent display as a silent, towering monument to an era that had simultaneously forged a sovereign nation and consumed millions of lives. As the 1970s drew to a close, China stepped firmly away from the turbulent revolutionary storms that had defined Mao's lifelong crusade, turning its immense human energy toward a pragmatic, outward-looking pursuit of wealth, power, and global integration that would reshape the modern world. The long and turbulent shadow of Mao Zedong continues to stretch across contemporary China, defining a complex legacy that is simultaneously revered, debated, and carefully managed by the ruling Communist Party. When Mao drew his final breath in September 1976, he left behind a nation that had undergone unprecedented social upheavals, structural transformations, and staggering human costs. Over the course of nearly 3 decades in supreme power, Mao succeeded in unifying a fractured, war-torn country, casting off the humiliating shackles of foreign imperialism, and establishing the People's Republic of China as an independent global power. Yet this profound national rejuvenation was achieved through sweeping revolutionary campaigns, political purges, and catastrophic economic experiments that consumed the lives of millions of citizens. Evaluating Mao Zedong requires confronting a profound historical paradox. The very same leader who rescued China from historical obscurity and empowered its peasantry also unleashed devastating internal storms that tore the nation's social fabric apart. From the earliest days of his revolutionary career in the hills of Shaoshan and the red bases of Jinggangshan, Mao maintained an unshakable faith in the power of human will and relentless ideological struggle. He viewed Marxism-Leninism not as a rigid dogma, but as a dynamic tool of permanent revolution, believing that true socialism could only be maintained by constantly upending established hierarchies, challenging bureaucratic complacency, and mobilizing the masses against perceived class enemies. This radical philosophy proved remarkably effective during the protracted armed struggles against the Japanese invaders and the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek, where mobile guerrilla warfare, rural mobilization, and supreme tactical flexibility allowed the Chinese Communist Party to achieve an improbable victory in 1949. However, when these same military-style mass campaigns were translated into peacetime governance, the results proved catastrophic. The relentless drive for ideological purity and utopian transformation left little room for economic rationality, administrative expertise, or basic human empathy, setting the stage for self-inflicted national tragedies on an unprecedented scale. The most devastating manifestations of this utopian impulse were seen during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Driven by a desperate desire to bypass traditional stages of economic development and surpass Western industrial output overnight, Mao's ambitious push for collectivization and backyard steel production plunged the Chinese countryside into the worst man-made famine in human history. Tens of millions of peasants starved to death, while unrealistic production quotas were forcibly extracted, and ideological slogans drowned out warnings of impending ruin. Rather than pausing to reassess these failed policies, Mao doubled down on his political authority, viewing criticism as a betrayal of the revolutionary cause. This defensive intolerance culminated a decade later in the Cultural Revolution, an unprecedented decade of institutional destruction, public humiliation, and political terror, in which millions of intellectuals, officials, and ordinary citizens were persecuted by radical Red Guards. Schools were closed, ancient cultural artifacts were smashed, and the party apparatus itself was temporarily paralyzed, leaving a profound generational trauma from which China's intellectual and cultural life took decades to recover. Despite these monumental disasters, the Communist Party, under the pragmatic leadership of Deng Xiaoping and his successors, chose a path of carefully calibrated historical reconciliation rather than total repudiation. The official formula adopted by the party, stating that Mao's contributions outweighed his errors by a ratio of 70 to 30, reflected a calculated political necessity. Total denunciation of Mao would have undermined the foundational legitimacy of the party-state itself, tearing away the ideological anchor that justified one-party rule. Consequently, Mao was preserved as the sacred founding patriarch of the nation, while his disastrous later policies were quietly sidelined in favor of economic reform, market opening, and pragmatic modernization. The famous portrait of Mao looking down benevolently from the gate of heavenly peace over Tiananmen Square remained untouched, a constant visual reminder of continuity even as the surrounding economy embraced global capitalism, private enterprise, and foreign trade on a massive scale. In the decades following his death, China underwent a breathtaking economic metamorphosis that lifted hundreds of millions of people out of absolute poverty, creating a booming industrial powerhouse and a confident global superpower. Yet this remarkable transformation occurred largely by departing from Maoist economic orthodoxy, while retaining the authoritarian political structures, centralized control, and party supremacy that Mao had spent his life forging. Modern Chinese cities boast glittering skyscrapers, advanced technology hubs, and a sprawling consumer middle class that would be entirely unrecognizable to the impoverished peasants Mao once mobilized. At the same time, public discussions of the darker chapters of the Mao era, such as the exact death toll of the Great Famine or the brutal abuses of the Red Guards, remain strictly controlled, heavily censored, and absent from official school textbooks. History is carefully curated to serve the present narrative of national strength and party infallibility. Ultimately, Mao Zedong remains a towering and deeply polarizing figure in the history of the 20th century. To his admirers and defenders, he was a visionary military genius and populist hero who restored China's national dignity, stood up to Western and Soviet hegemony, and gave a voice to the poorest rural masses. To his critics and the survivors of his purges, he was an uncompromising autocrat whose dogmatic fanaticism and ruthless consolidation of power inflicted unspeakable suffering and robbed generations of their freedom and futures. As China navigates its modern destiny as a dominant global force, the legacy of the great helmsman continues to cast a long, complex shadow, a permanent testament